The last fair. Hello everyone. I hope you're all doing well. I've been debating whether to share this for weeks now, but the truth is I can't keep it inside anymore. Maybe someone out there can make sense of what happened to me because I still can't. Not entirely. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that I've been driving Uber and Lyft for the past 8 years, mostly nights. Mostly in and around the greater Nashville area. I know every exit, every back road, every 24-hour diner between downtown and the county line. Night driving is a different world. You learn things about people that the daylight never shows you: their fights, their grief, their confessions. Passengers talk to drivers the same way people talk to bartenders. Like we're not really there, I'm not gonna pretend I'm a good man. I want to be honest about that up front because I think what happened to me has everything to do with who I was before it happened. I have a wife. Her name is Diane. We've been married 11 years, and I would tell you she's the best thing that ever happened to me, which is true. And also that I've spent the better part of a decade treating her like she's optional. I'm not proud of it. I've tried to explain it away with excuses. The loneliness of night shifts, the drinking I picked up after my father died, the fact that when you drive strangers around at 2 in the morning, certain opportunities present themselves if you're not the kind of man who walks away from them. I am not that kind of man, or rather, I wasn't. Diane knew something was off for years. Not the specifics, but the feeling. Women always know the feeling. She'd wait up some nights and I'd come home at 4 in the morning smelling like someone else's perfume. And I'd say I'd been helping a passenger who had too much to drink, that I waited with them until their friend arrived. She believed me because she wanted to. Or maybe she didn't believe me but loved me enough to pretend. That's almost worse when you really think about it. The worst of it, the thing I haven't even told my brother, was that it wasn't just random. There was one woman in particular. Her name was Melanie, and I'd been seeing her off and on for almost 2 years. She was a bartender at a place near the Gulch, and I'd pick her up after closing shifts when she needed a ride. That's how it started. One night became a habit, and the habit became something I told myself was complicated, but was actually just cowardice dressed up as emotion. About 6 weeks before everything fell apart, Melanie ended it. Said she was tired of being a secret, tired of holidays alone, tired of me. I told Diane I was upset about a conflict with a passenger. I cried in the bathroom and she knocked on the door and asked if I was okay, and I said yes. She made me tea. That memory still sits in my chest like a stone. After Melanie, I told myself I was done, that it was a wake-up call. I was going to be the husband I'd never been. I bought Diane flowers twice in 1 week, which made her laugh and ask if I was sick. For about 3 weeks, I actually meant it. Then came the night of October 14th. I remember the date because it was the evening after Diane's mother's birthday dinner. It had been a good night, actually warm and easy. The kind of family evening that reminds you what you're throwing away. I left around 11 to do a few rides just to keep the rating up. 1 ride, I told myself, maybe 2. The first fare was a group of college kids going to a party on Belmont. Easy. The second was an older gentleman who fell asleep almost immediately and thanked me profusely when we arrived at his assisted living facility. Normal night. Then the app pinged again. A pickup on Nolensville Pike, near the old rail yard. A little unusual for the area at midnight. It's not exactly nightlife territory, but I accepted it. When I pulled up, there was a woman standing alone on the sidewalk. No streetlight directly above her, but there was enough ambient glow from a nearby warehouse sign that I could see her clearly. She was tall, dressed in a long dark coat even though it wasn't particularly cold, and her hair was very dark and pulled over one shoulder. She looked, and I'm not exaggerating when I say this, like someone had sculpted her face from memory of every beautiful woman they'd ever seen. She got in the back seat without saying anything. I glanced in the rear view. "Hey, headed to Germantown?" "That's right," she said. Her voice was quiet and even, like someone who chooses their words carefully. I pulled onto the road. She didn't look at her phone the way most passengers do. She just sat with her hands folded in her lap, looking straight ahead. I found myself checking the mirror more than I should have. "Long night?" I asked. "Not as long as yours will be," she said. I laughed, assuming it was an odd joke. "Yeah, I usually go until about 2. She didn't respond to that, but after a moment she said, "You smell like flowers. Did your wife make you feel guilty again?" I felt my hands tighten on the wheel. "Sorry?" "The tea," she said. "She made you tea when you cried. About Melanie." The air in the car went cold. Not metaphorically, I mean I felt the temperature drop physically, like someone had opened a window, though all the windows were closed. I don't know what you're talking about, I said, and my voice came out smaller than I intended. She smiled in the mirror. I could see it clearly, and something about it was wrong in a way I couldn't name right away. The proportions were off, too wide, the teeth too even. You made promises in that bathroom, she said, after Melanie left. You made a promise and then you broke it in 3 weeks. You were going to do it again tonight, weren't you, before I got in? I genuinely hadn't been that night. I really was just driving. But the fact that she said it like she already knew the trajectory of my evening made my skin crawl. Who are you? I asked. You don't need my name, she said. You need to pay attention to the road. We drove in silence for a while. I told myself this was just a strange passenger, maybe someone who'd overheard something at the restaurant, maybe someone who knew Melanie or Diane in some roundabout Nashville way. It's a small city when you really live in it. I tried to rationalize. Then she started humming. I can't describe the sound accurately. It wasn't unpleasant at first. It was low and meandering, almost like a lullaby, the kind of thing that makes your eyes feel heavy. I blinked hard and realized I'd drifted slightly into the other lane. I corrected and cracked the window. Please don't do that, I said. She stopped humming, and then she spoke again, and this time her voice was different, lower, flatter, like it was coming from somewhere further away than the back seat. She packed a bag 3 months ago, she said. Did you know that, Diane? She packed a bag and sat on the edge of the bed for 2 hours and then unpacked it. She decided to stay because she thought you were changing. She told her sister she thought you were finally changing. I nearly ran a red light. I stopped hard enough that we both lurched forward. How do you know that? I whispered. I looked in the rearview mirror. The woman's head was bowed forward, her dark hair falling down over her face entirely. Her shoulders were shaking the way someone shakes when they're crying, but the sound coming from her wasn't crying, as it was laughing, a dry, rhythmic, clicking laughter that didn't sound like any human laugh I've ever heard. I said her name. I called her Mom, and she slowly raised her head. I will not describe what I saw in detail because I don't think I'm capable of doing it accurately, and because part of me still wonders if what I saw was real, or if my mind was doing something to protect itself from reality. What I can tell you is that what looked back at me from that seat was not the face that had gotten into my car. The eyes were wrong, too pale, lit from somewhere inside. The smile was still there, stretched across something that no longer resembled a face so much as a suggestion of one, like a mask worn by something that had never studied how faces actually work. I screamed. I genuinely screamed. I don't think I'd screamed like that since I was a child. I wrenched the car sideways and came to a stop half on the curb on a quiet side street. I threw open the door and ran. I don't know how long I ran. I know I ended up in a gas station parking lot on a street I recognized, and that the attendant came out because I was standing there shaking and he thought I'd been in an accident. He brought me a cup of water and asked if I wanted him to call someone. I called Diane. She picked up on the second ring, half asleep, and I started crying before I could say anything. She talked to me until I could breathe again. She didn't ask too many questions that night. She just stayed on the line. I left the car where it was and paid for an Uber home. I know the irony. I didn't tell Diane the full story that night, but over the following weeks something cracked open in me that I couldn't close again. I started talking slowly, haltingly about Melanie, about the others before her, about the years of it. She didn't yell. She cried. I cried. We sat in the kitchen for what felt like most of a night, and she said things I deserved to hear, and some things that were harder than that. She didn't leave. Not immediately. We've been in counseling since November, and I won't tell you it's easy or that the damage isn't real, because it is. There are days she looks at me and I can see the math she's doing behind her eyes, weighing what was against what could be. I went back to the street the next morning to retrieve my car. It was exactly where I'd left it. The back seat was empty. No sign anyone had been there. But the rear-view mirror was turned downward position so you'd see nothing but the floor. I don't know what she was. I've read since then about figures in folklore, spirits from various traditions that are described as beautiful women who appear to unfaithful men at night, that exist specifically as judgment, as mirror, as consequence. I don't know if I believe in any of that, not exactly, but I believe in this. Whatever got into my car that night knew things it had no business knowing, and it wanted me to know that it knew them. I still drive, though I switched to days. I no longer take late pickups in unfamiliar areas. I haven't had a drink since October 14th, and I'm not sure I want one. The thing that stays with me isn't the face in the mirror, though that visits me sometimes at 3 in the morning when the house is quiet. What stays with me is what she said before it happened. That Diane had packed a bag, that she stayed because she believed I was changing. I think about that every single day. Maybe what I saw was a hallucination brought on by stress and guilt and too many nights of bad decisions finally finding the door. Maybe it was something else. I'm not qualified to say. What I know is this: I had been given chances, real ones, the kind most people don't get, and I kept folding them up and putting them in a drawer. Something found me in that car and held up a mirror I couldn't look away from. I don't know if I believe I deserved it, but I don't think it was wrong. The passenger at County Road 12. Good evening, my name is James. I'm 27 years old and I live in Austin, Texas, where I work as a data analyst for a mid-size financial consulting firm. I mention this because I want you to understand what kind of person I am before you hear this story: methodical, numbers-oriented, someone who lives inside spreadsheets and probability models for a living. If a figure doesn't add up, I find the error. It's not a personality trait I chose so much as one that calcified over years of education and habit. I don't believe in things I can't verify. My girlfriend once dragged me to a psychic fair on South Congress Avenue, and I spent the entire time quietly explaining cold reading techniques to anyone nearby who seemed interested. She wasn't thrilled. But that's genuinely just who I am. I say all of this because what I'm about to share is not something I personally experienced. It happened to a close friend of mine, a man I've known since we were placed in the same dormitory freshman year at UT. For the purpose of this account, I'll call him Derek, though that isn't his name. Derek has driven for one of the major rideshare platforms for about 3 years. He bought a used Camry, fitted it with seat covers, attached his phone mount to the dash, and decided it was a reasonable way to supplement his income from his day job at a hardware store. He runs the late shift, usually 9 in the evening, until somewhere between 2 and 3 in the morning because the surge pricing is better after dark and the roads are clearer. He knows the streets around Austin the way most people know the layout of their own homes. He could probably navigate from Zilker Park to the airport with his eyes closed. He's a practical man, Derek, not superstitious. He was raised in a religious household, but somewhere during college the faith softened and the skepticism hardened in its place. He'll tell you himself that after 3 years of strangers sitting in his back seat crying, arguing, sleeping, occasionally saying things that would genuinely alarm a mental health professional, he has very little patience for talk of the supernatural. Life is strange enough, he always says, without adding ghosts to the list. I tell you all of this because when Derek showed up at my apartment door at nearly 2 in the morning on a Tuesday in late October, I could see immediately that something had fundamentally changed in him. That night I had been working late, pushing through quarterly projections with a cup of coffee I'd stopped tasting around midnight. When my buzzer rang, I wasn't expecting anyone. I answered it and heard Derek's voice, a flat, quiet, stripped of the casual ease it normally carried, and I buzzed him in without asking a single question. He came through the door slowly. His left wrist was wrapped in a makeshift bandage of folded paper towels held by electrical tape. His jacket was torn at one elbow. His face was the thing that stopped me, though. It wasn't injured exactly. It was emptied the way a room looks after someone has moved out, technically intact but carrying the echo of something that used to occupy it. He sat down on my couch without speaking, and I didn't push him. I got him a glass of water, then thought better of it and poured him a bourbon, and I pulled up a chair across from him and waited. He drank half the bourbon in a single movement, set the glass on his knee, and stared at the middle distance for a long moment. "I'm going to tell you what happened," he said finally, "and I need you to not do what you always do. Don't start explaining it, not yet. Just let me finish." I told him I wouldn't. I wasn't completely certain I could keep that promise, but I made it anyway. Then he told me. It had started at around 10:15 that night. He was already a few hours into his shift, 4 or 5 rides completed, nothing out of the ordinary. He accepted a new request. It came in as a scheduled ride, meaning the passenger had booked it in advance rather than requesting in real time. The pickup address was on a quiet residential street in East Austin. The account had a 5-star rating. The listed destination was St. David's Medical Center on 32nd Street. He pulled up to the address and saw an elderly woman standing on the front porch, one hand resting on the railing, waving at him with the other. She was dressed carefully, dark slacks, a cream-colored blouse, a pale wool cardigan despite the fact that it was nearly 75 degrees outside, and low-heeled shoes. Her white hair was pinned back neatly and she wore pearl earrings. She was probably in her late 70s or early 80s. She moved down the front path with the slow deliberateness of someone who has learned, through experience, that their body will punish carelessness. Derek got out to help her, and she waved him off with a polite but firm gesture. "I'm perfectly fine, thank you," she said. Her voice was steady and clear. She smelled of lavender and old-fashioned talcum powder scent that Derek recognized from his grandmother. She settled herself into the back seat with great care, and when she was comfortable, she folded her hands in her lap and looked ahead. "Thank you for coming at this hour," she said. "I have a small request before we head to the hospital if you'll allow it. My grandson is staying at a property just outside the city, a family place on one of the county roads east of the highway. He doesn't have his own transportation tonight and I'd like to bring him with me. It shouldn't take more than 20 minutes out of our way." Derek was cautious about detour requests. He'd had passengers try to turn a 15-minute trip into an hour-long errand. But the woman's composure, the measured way she spoke, the quiet confidence of someone who has navigated the world for 7 or 8 decades and learned exactly how to ask for things put him at ease. He agreed, asked for the address, and she gave it to him without hesitation. A county road number, east of the highway, past the last development, out into the rural stretch where the GPS sometimes lost its grip on the landscape. "You're very kind," she said simply, and looked out the window, so he drove. She was quiet for most of the ride. Some passengers want to talk the entire time, others treat the car as a private space and say nothing at all. The older passengers especially tend to prefer silence. Derek had the radio on low or country station out of habit, and the woman didn't object. What he noticed after about 10 minutes was that she was murmuring something beneath the level of the radio, too soft to make out, a continuous quiet murmur. He thought at first she was on a phone call with an earpiece he hadn't seen, but when he looked in the mirror he could see both her hands folded in her lap and her lips barely moving. It sounded, he said, like someone reciting something from memory. He didn't ask. The county road was dark in a way that city people sometimes forget. Roads can be the kind of darkness that only exists when you get far enough from any skyline that the atmosphere stops glowing. His headlights opened a corridor through it, and outside that corridor, there was nothing but black and the shapes of mesquite and cedar pressing close on both sides, their low branches reaching toward the road. After roughly 17 minutes, the woman leaned forward and asked him to turn right onto an unmarked dirt track that appeared in his headlights without warning. He braked and hesitated. "Are you certain?" he asked. "I don't have anything showing up on navigation for that direction." "I've been coming to this property for 40 years, she said calmly. "I could find it without the headlights." He turned. The track was unpaved and rough enough that his Camry scraped low twice in the first 100 feet before the ground leveled out. He drove another 3 or 4 minutes through the dark, the trees tighter on both sides now, until the track widened into a clearing and his lights fell on a house. It was a single-story structure, L-shaped, the kind of house that gets added onto across several generations so that different sections carry different roof lines and different materials that never quite match. Mismatched window sizes, a covered porch that had warped and pulled away from the main structure at one corner. There were no lights on anywhere inside, not one, but a single bare yellow bulb burned above the front door, mounted on a rusted fixture, throwing a jaundiced circle of light onto the wooden boards of the porch below it. The woman opened her door. "I'll just be a moment," she said. "He's expecting us. Please leave the engine running." "Would you like me to walk you to the door?" "No, thank you. He's shy with people he doesn't know." She walked to the house slowly but without faltering, pushed the front door open. It moved inward without being unlocked, which Derek noticed, and disappeared inside. He sat with the engine idling and his window cracked. Outside the car, the silence was the kind that has weight. Somewhere at a distance, he could hear a sound he couldn't immediately categorize, a low, irregular clicking or tapping that seemed to emanate from the tree line without locating itself anywhere specific. He checked his phone. 1 bar flickering in and out. He checked the time. He waited. 10 minutes passed, then 15. He was beginning to genuinely debate whether to get out and knock when the front door opened. The woman came back onto the porch, and she was not alone. Walking beside her, or rather keeping pace with her in a way that was slightly off from normal walking, each step placed with an unusual deliberateness, was a boy. He appeared to be 12 or 13 years old. He was slightly built with dark hair that hung forward over his face in a way that covered most of his features. He was wearing a long-sleeved shirt, buttoned all the way to the collar, and heavy dark trousers that were far too formal for his apparent age. The kind of clothes that would look at home in a church photograph from the 1970s. One of his arms was held close against his body at a bent angle that seemed structural rather than voluntary. The woman opened the rear door and the boy got in beside her. He did not look up. He did not acknowledge Derek in any way. Derek waited for an introduction. Neither of them spoke. The woman simply settled back and said, "St. David's, please. Through the highway is fine." Derek put the car in reverse and began turning around in the clearing. In doing so, he checked his rear-view mirror habit, after 3 years, as involuntary as breathing, and for a moment his headlights, sweeping the clearing as the car turned, threw enough reflected light into the interior that he got a clear look at the boy's face. He told me later that he couldn't explain precisely what disturbed him about it. The face was the right shape for a child. The features were individually recognizable: eyes, nose, mouth, all present. But they sat on the face incorrectly, the way a sentence reads correctly word by word, but produces a meaning that doesn't cohere. The proportions were wrong in a way that Derek's brain kept trying and failing to process, as if what he was looking at was an approximation assembled without access to the original. And the skin. He said the skin looked dry in a way that had nothing to do with weather or health. The kind of dry that belongs to something that has been kept rather than something that is living. He looked away from the mirror. He found the track and drove. They reached the main highway. The navigation showed 18 minutes to St. David's. Derek kept his eyes on the road and his hands at 10 and 2, and he did not look in the mirror. The woman occasionally spoke to the boy in a low murmur, the same steady, almost memorized cadence he'd noticed earlier, and the boy made no audible response. About 10 minutes from the hospital, the woman said quietly, "He's very cold. Is there any way to warm the car?" Derek turned off the air conditioning. The night was warm, and the car began to heat immediately. He cracked his own window to compensate. He said the temperature in the back didn't change. He couldn't explain how he knew that from the front seat. He just said he could feel it. He checked the mirror. The boy was looking directly at him, not the way a passenger glances toward the front of a car, directly, precisely, with a stillness and a completeness of focus that registered in Derek's body before his mind could process it. The eyes were very dark enough that in the mirror's reflection he couldn't separate the iris from the pupil, and they were fixed on his reflected eyes with an expression that Derek, when he tried to describe it to me, could only characterize as the expression of something that has learned what an expression looks like without having ever needed one before. The car swerved. Derek corrected it hard, heard the woman make a small startled sound. "I'm sorry," he said. "Something on the road." He did not check the mirror again for the rest of the drive. He pulled into the drop-off loop at Street, David's emergency entrance at 11:42. He got out and opened the back door. The woman emerged first, and this time she accepted Derek's hand to steady herself as she stepped out. He held the door and looked into the back seat to allow the boy room to get out. The back seat was empty. He stood completely still. The seat was unoccupied, both positions, visibly, clearly empty. He leaned in. No one behind the driver's seat either. He looked at the floor. He straightened up. "Ma'am?" he said. His voice came out strange. "Where is the boy?" The woman turned to look at him. There was a pause, a fraction of a second, in which her expression did something complicated and then returned to composure. "I'm sorry?" "Your grandson, the boy from the property." She looked at him steadily for a moment. Something moved across her face that wasn't confusion, it was older than confusion, quieter, like the acknowledgement of something long expected. "Young man," she said, "I came here alone tonight." She turned and walked into the emergency entrance. Derek stood at the curb for a long time. He checked the back seat 3 more times. He looked under the car. He walked the full circumference of the vehicle. When he finally got back in and sat in the driver's seat, he adjusted the mirror from habit. In it, and in the warm amber light cast by the hospital entrance, he could see the rear headrest on the right-hand passenger side clearly. There were 2 handprints pressed into the fabric, small. The fabric had been compressed in the precise shape of 2 small palms and the spread of small fingers, the way an impression forms in soft material when something cold and heavy presses into it for a sustained period. Derek got out of the car and was sick beside the landscaping at the edge of the drop-off loop. He sat on the curb for 23 minutes before he felt steady enough to drive and not to take another fare, but to come directly to my apartment. That's what he told me. I didn't laugh. I tried not to immediately start assembling alternative explanations, though the habit is deep and I could feel it pressing against the inside of my chest the whole time he was talking. He had, of course, the ride logged in the app, 1 passenger, the account name listed as B. Hargrove, 5 stars, pickup at the East Austin address at 10:21 p.m., destination St. David's Medical Center, completed at 11:42 p.m. The detour to the county road track was in his GPS history, 12 minutes and 40 seconds of off-route navigation, logged automatically. The following morning, Derek called the phone number associated with the account. He said he wanted to check on the passenger, make sure she'd been seen by a doctor. It was a thin reason, but he needed to hear her voice. He needed something to close against. A man answered. Derek asked for B. Hargrove and said he was a rideshare driver who'd brought her to St. David's the previous evening. The man was quiet for a moment. Then he asked Derek to repeat himself. Derek did. The man said that wasn't possible. He said his mother had passed away 14 months ago and that the phone account was still registered in her name because the family hadn't gotten around to cancelling the service. He'd had a handful of calls over the past year, mostly numbers he didn't recognize, scammers he'd assumed, using her name to establish false familiarity. But his mother had in fact used rideshare apps regularly. He asked Derek for the name again. Barbara Hargrove, the initial B on the account. The line was quiet for several seconds. Then the man said that his mother had been admitted through the emergency entrance at St. David's Medical Center, that she had been alone when she arrived, that she had passed from a cardiac event in the early hours of a morning in late August, 14 months prior. She had no grandchildren. The property on the county road, Derek found it in Travis County property records once he had the GPS coordinates pulled from his own app history. It appeared in the records as belonging to the Hargrove family. The house had been vacant for 9 years. It had been listed for sale twice, and both transactions had fallen apart before closing, both times with the buyers providing only vague explanations. The listing photographs from the most recent sale attempt were still accessible through a real estate archive site. Derek found them and looked through them and then sent me a link without comment. The photographs showed empty rooms, the kind of emptiness that settles into a house that has been still for a long time, the particular quality of abandoned interiors or where the light comes in wrong and the proportions of ordinary spaces seem to have shifted slightly. In the fourth photograph, taken in what the listing described as a rear bedroom, something had been left near the baseboard in the far corner. A small shoe, dark leather, old-fashioned with a buckle strap. The kind of shoe that appears in church portraits and school photographs from 50 years ago. One shoe, left behind or placed there. It was impossible to tell which. I looked at that photograph for a long time. I am a rational person. I work in data. I trust evidence, causality, and things that can be measured and reproduced. I have spent years being the one in the room who explains why things are not what they appear to be. But I also remember the morning after Derek came to my apartment, watching him walk down to the parking lot in the early light, peel the seat cover off the right rear passenger seat of his Camry, fold it into itself without looking at it, carry it to the dumpster at the edge of the lot, and drop it in. He didn't say anything. He didn't look at me. He just walked back to the car and stood beside it with his hands in his pockets, staring at the pavement. He hasn't taken a late-night fare since, and I remember that on the drive to take him home that morning, I sat in the front passenger seat with my hands folded in my lap, and I kept my eyes on the road ahead, and I did not once look at the seat behind me. Not once. The last stop on Route 9, I never believed in ghosts. Not until the night the road believed in me. My name is Calvin, and I've been driving long-haul freight for 11 years. But before that, before the highways and the 18-wheelers and the CB radio chatter, I spent 3 years driving a city bus in Shreveport, Louisiana. Route 9, night shift. It sounds unglamorous, and it was mostly. But that route gave me a story I've never told in full. Not to my wife, not to my pastor, not to the therapist I saw briefly in 2019 when the insomnia got bad. I'm telling it now because I think it needs to be said out loud, and because keeping locked inside a person does something to them over time. Route 9 ran from downtown Shreveport out through a stretch of older neighborhoods, past the Dollar General on Milam, past the shut-down textile plant on the edge of Cross Lake, and finally out to a cluster of subsidized housing developments near the parish line. The whole round trip was about 90 minutes. During the day it was fine. Busy, actually. People going to work, kids going to school, older women with grocery bags. Normal life. But the last run of the night, departing downtown at 11:40 p.m. and returning by 1:15 in the morning, that was a different world entirely. By that hour, Route 9 was near empty. Maybe 2 or 3 passengers max, and usually nobody at all past the lake. I'd come to enjoy the solitude. I'd turn the heat up a little, keep the radio low. I liked late-night jazz, the kind that felt like it had a story behind every note, and I'd let the bus hum along the empty streets like a lit-up ship crossing a dark sea. I know that sounds poetic for a bus driver, but there's a real beauty to those hours if you let yourself see it. The night in question was a Tuesday in late October. I remember the month because the city had put orange and black banners on the lampposts on Texas Street. Halloween was 4 days away. I'd had a quiet run. By the time I reached the last development, a place everyone called the Willows, though there wasn't a willow tree in sight, there were 0 passengers aboard. I did the loop, opened the doors at the final stop as required, waited the regulation 2 minutes, then pulled out and started back toward downtown. That's when I saw him in the mirror. A man, sitting in the very last row on the right side of the bus, the row along the back window. I felt a jolt in my chest. I was absolutely certain no one had boarded at the Willows. I'd watched the stop the way you always do, and automatically. The platform had been empty under the orange parking lot light. But there he was, a large man in a dark jacket sitting perfectly still, facing forward. His hands were flat on his thighs, palms down, the way someone sits when they're very carefully trying not to move. My first thought was that I'd missed him somehow, that he'd been sleeping low in a seat before the last development, and I'd just failed to notice. That happens with sleeping passengers, they sort of disappear below the seat back. I told myself that was the explanation, and I almost believed it. I watched him in the mirror for about a mile. He didn't shift, didn't look out the window, didn't reach for a phone, just sat there with his hands on his thighs, staring at the back of the seat in front of him, or maybe at nothing. It was hard to tell. "Hey," I called back. "Sir, you okay back there?" Nothing. "You know this is the return trip, right? Last stop was the Willows." Silence. Not even a change in posture. I'll be honest with you. At this point, I was more annoyed than scared. I'd had unresponsive passengers before, drunk high, deeply asleep, once a man having a diabetic episode. I pulled the bus over at a wide spot on Greenwood Road, put it in park, and got up. I walked down the aisle. The overhead lights were on, the fluorescent kind that make everything look slightly medical and cold. I could hear the engine idling, and somewhere faintly the jazz station. Coltrane, I think. Something slow. As I got closer, I noticed a few things in quick succession, the way you notice details when your senses sharpen. His jacket was old, not vintage old or intentionally worn, genuinely deteriorating. The left shoulder seam had come apart. The fabric had a texture that looked almost damp, though it wasn't raining. His shoes were wrong. They were the kind of heavy leather work boots men wore in another era, thick soles, brass eyelets. My grandfather had shoes like that in a photograph from the 1950s, and his hands. The hands on his thighs were the hands of an older man, large-knuckled, deeply lined up, but the skin had a greyish pallor that I told myself was just the lighting. "Sir," I said again, stopping about 4 feet from him. "I need you to—" He turned his head. I have tried many times since that night to explain the feeling that hit me in that moment. It wasn't just fear, it was something older than fear, something that lives below the rational mind, in the part of the brain that still remembers what it was to be small and soft and hunted in the dark. Every hair on my body stood up. My vision narrowed, my feet became very heavy. He was looking directly at me, and his eyes were the wrong color. Not black, I want to be specific here, because the other story I've heard where someone says a ghost had black eyes always seemed theatrical to me. These eyes were pale, almost white, like the iris had been bleached out, leaving just the dark center. They weren't looking through me. They were looking at me with a focus and precision that felt deliberate. He had a full beard, mostly gray. His face was lined and weathered. He might have been 65 or he might have been 100. It was impossible to say. He opened his mouth. No sound came out, but his lips moved slowly the way someone mouths words in prayer. 3 or 4 syllables repeated. I backed up. I'm not ashamed to say it. I turned around, walked fast back to the driver's seat, sat down and gripped the steering wheel with both hands. I was breathing the way you breathe after you've nearly had an accident, fast and shallow and almost laughing from the adrenaline. I looked in the mirror. He was still there, still facing forward now, hands back on his thighs. I pulled onto the road and drove. I told myself, you are going to drive to the downtown terminal, you are going to radio dispatch, and you are going to handle this like a professional. Maybe the man was having a medical crisis, maybe he was mentally ill. Whatever was going on, the answer was at the terminal with backup and not on a dark road alone. I watched the mirror constantly. He didn't move for 2 miles, 3. Then the radio cut out. I don't mean it faded or got static, I mean it went from Coltrane mid-note to complete silence, and as if the wire had been pulled. I reached for the dial and felt the air temperature in the bus drop. Noticeably physically drop, not a draft. A presence, the way a cold front feels different from wind. I looked in the mirror. The back of the bus was empty. The seat where he had been sitting held nothing but shadows. I stared for a long moment. Then I checked every mirror, the right exterior, the left, the wide-angle passenger mirror above the windshield. Nobody. In a bus, there are very few places a person can go. He was simply gone. I drove the remaining 4 miles to the terminal in a state I can only describe as carefully constructed calm, the kind you hold together through sheer concentration, because if you let it slip, you'll pull over on the shoulder and shake until dawn. I pulled into the bay at 12:51 a.m. Marcus was there, on the night maintenance crew, and he took one look at me and said, "What happened to you?" I told him. All of it, the man in the last row, the walk down the aisle, the eyes, the disappearance. Marcus listened without interrupting. He was a deliberate, quiet man who had worked nights at that terminal for 18 years, and he had the particular stillness of someone who had seen most things. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, then he said, "What did he look like?" I described the jacket, the boots, the grey beard, the pale eyes. Marcus got up and walked to the small supervisor's office off the main bay. He came back with a laminated page, the kind of printout that had been handled many times, the plastic worn soft at the edges. He set it down in front of me. It was a memorial announcement, the kind a transit company prints when an employee dies. A photograph, a name, dates of birth and death. The man in the photograph was wearing the same jacket, the same beard, and his name was Walter Dempsey. He had driven Route 9 for 22 years. He had died on a Tuesday night in late October. The article said heart attack behind the wheel on Greenwood Road 16 years before the night I saw him. According to the announcement, he had been found slumped forward over the steering wheel. The bus had idled in place for almost 40 minutes before another driver spotted it. I stared at the photograph for a long time. "He comes back every October," Marcus said simply, sitting back down with his coffee. "Always on the night runs, always Route 9. Drivers don't usually talk about it. Management definitely doesn't. But you ask anyone who's worked late on that route for more than a year, and they'll tell you." "Why?" I asked. "Why does he come back?" Marcus shrugged. "Maybe he just loved the route, maybe he didn't know how to stop." He looked into his coffee cup. "Some people, they spend so long doing something, same road, same turn, same stops, that it gets into them, it becomes part of what they are." He paused. "Maybe dying doesn't change that." I sat with that for a while. I went back to driving the route. I want you to know that I didn't quit the next day. I drove Route 9 for another 8 months before I transitioned to freight and left Shreveport. I saw Walter Dempsey one more time the following October. Same stretch of road, same last row. That time, I didn't get up. I just called back, "Evening, Walter," and kept my eyes on the road. He was gone by the time we reached the lake. I've thought a lot about what Marcus said, that some things get so deeply into a person that dying doesn't clear them out. That muscle memory or love or plain stubbornness can persist in a way that physics doesn't have good language for. I've driven close to 1,000,000 miles since those Route 9 days, interstates, mountain roads, long desert straightaways where the horizon doesn't change for 2 hours at a time. I've had plenty of quiet nights to think. And here's what I've decided I believe. The world has layers we only glimpse at the edges of ordinary life at 1 a.m. on an empty road, in the blue light just before sleep. In the moments when the radio cuts out for no reason and the air goes cold and something from another layer pushes through briefly into yours. Most of the time it frightens us because we're not built for it, but sometimes if you calm down long enough to really look like I wish I had that first night, instead of backing away, I think what you'd see isn't something monstrous at all. Just someone who loved the road so much they couldn't quite let go of it. What she asked of me. My name is Daniel Wayne Crawford, and I've been hauling freight across the southeastern United States for going on 19 years now. I'm from a small town called Decatur in Tennessee, and if you've ever driven through that part of the country, you'll know that the roads there are long, dark, and quiet in a way that city folks don't quite understand. Quiet in a way that has weight to it. The kind of quiet that makes you feel like the land itself is paying attention to you. I'm not a man who scares easily. I've driven through flash floods in Georgia, ice storms in the Carolinas, and fog so thick in the Mississippi Delta that I could barely see past my own hood ornament. I've had blowouts at 70 miles an hour, I've swerved to miss deer the size of small horses, and I've pulled over more than once to help strangers in situations that most people would keep driving past. I say all of this not to make myself sound impressive, but because I want you to understand the kind of man I was before what happened to me on Highway 41, somewhere between Pulaski and Lawrenceburg, on a Tuesday night in the autumn of 2019. Because after that night, after those 2 nights to be precise, I became a different man. Not worse, I'd like to think, but permanently changed in a way that I can't fully put into words, though I've spent a good part of the last few years trying. And it was the kind of October evening that makes you remember why you chose this life in the first place, if you're being honest with yourself. The air had that cool, clean bite to it that only comes after the summer heat finally breaks for good. And the tree lines on both sides of the highway were showing their colors even in the darkness, the headlights catching flashes of deep orange and red between the trunks as I rolled south. I had a full load of paper goods bound for a distribution center outside of Florence, Alabama, and I was running ahead of schedule for once, which always puts a man in a decent mood. I'd been on the road since 4 that afternoon out of Nashville, and by the time I reached that stretch of 41, it was pushing 11 o'clock. My thermos was empty, my lower back was doing what it always does after a few hours in the seat, and I decided I'd pull off for a few minutes to stretch my legs and make myself a fresh coffee on the small propane burner I keep in the cab for exactly these occasions. It's a habit my father had. He drove for 32 years, and I picked it up from him the same way I picked up most things worth knowing, by watching and doing, not by being told. There was a wide gravel shoulder just past a curve in the road. The kind of natural pullout that forms over years of trucks doing exactly what I was doing. Nothing official, no signage, just a wide spot in the darkness where the gravel had been packed flat by countless tires. There were a few trees set back maybe 20 feet from the road's edge, and between the road and the trees, a long strip of tall grass and wildflowers that had mostly gone to seed for the season. I parked, killed the engine, and climbed down. The silence out there was immediate and absolute, broken only by the distant sound of a truck somewhere far behind me and the low chorus of crickets that Tennessee never quite gives up. Even in October, I stretched my back, rolled my neck, and stood there for a moment just breathing, looking up at a sky full of stars that you simply do not see from any city on earth. I walked a few paces toward the tree line to relieve myself, as men in this profession do without ceremony, and on my way back to the cab, I passed through that strip of grass along the shoulder. In the dark, I wasn't watching my feet particularly carefully, and at some point my boot caught on something low to the ground. I stumbled, caught myself on the side of the trailer, and looked back to see what had tripped me. It was a cluster of artificial flowers, the kind made from silk and wire that people leave at roadside memorials stuck into the ground on a short plastic stake. The kind of thing you see dozens of times on any long highway drive and eventually stop noticing entirely. My boot had caught the stake and pulled it halfway out of the ground, and the little bouquet, maybe 6 or 7 purple and white flowers, had been knocked sideways into the grass. I looked at it for a second in the dark. I felt a passing thought I should fix that, but the coffee was calling and my back was aching, and I told myself it was fine, that it was already half fallen and probably had been for a while. I pushed it back into the ground, not particularly carefully or firmly, and got on with making my coffee. I sat on the running board of the cab for about 15 minutes, drank half my coffee, and watched the stars. I thought about my daughter back in Decatur, who had just started her first year of high school that fall, and about my wife Linda, who had taken on extra shifts at the hospital and probably hadn't sat down before 10 o'clock a single night that week. The familiar guilt of this life settled over me the way it always does during the quiet moments, that low, dull ache of knowing how much you're missing while you're out here doing what you do. I sealed up my thermos, climbed back in, and got back on the highway. I want to be careful about how I describe what came next, because I've told this story a handful of times over the years, and the most important thing I've learned is that the scariest parts were not the dramatic ones. The scariest part was the accumulation, the sense that something was noticing me and had decided it wasn't finished with me yet. It started subtly, the way these things apparently always do. About 3 miles down the road, my radio cut out mid-song. Not static, not a signal fade. It simply went silent. I reached over and turned the dial, checked the volume, turned it off and back on. Nothing. The display was lit, the unit appeared to be functioning, but there was only silence where the music had been. I've had radios malfunction before. I told myself that's what it was. Then came the smell. There is no delicate way to describe it. It was the smell of old flowers. Dried, decomposing flower petals, sweet and rotten at the same time. The way a vase smells when you've let the water go too long, and it filled the cab so suddenly and so completely that I actually looked around as though I might find the source of it somewhere in the vehicle with me. There was nothing. Both windows were cracked, maybe an inch, standard practice for staying alert, but the smell wasn't coming from outside. It had no direction. It was simply there, surrounding me, as though it had always been there and I was only just now noticing it. I rolled down the window all the way and the cold air rushed in, and within about a minute the smell was gone. I drove another few miles telling myself it was nothing. And then I saw her. She was standing on the right shoulder of the highway, facing away from me, in a pale dress that caught the light of my high beams in a way that made it almost luminous. Long dark hair, not moving, not hitchhiking, not waving, just standing there facing the tree line, still as a post. My first thought was genuine concern. A woman alone on a dark highway at this hour, dressed like that, no jacket, no reflective gear, nothing. I slowed down. I put on my hazards. As I drew even with her, I looked over. She turned her head toward me. I cannot fully explain what I felt in that instant. I have tried many times. It wasn't the way she looked. I only saw her face for a fraction of a second before I was past her. It was something in the quality of the moment itself, a wrongness that registered below thought in whatever part of the brain is oldest and most honest. My hands tightened on the wheel. My foot found the accelerator. In my mirror there was nothing there. I drove to Florence without stopping. I parked at the distribution center and sat in my cab for 40 minutes before I was ready to get out and check in. I told the dock supervisor I'd hit traffic. He didn't ask any questions. I won't pretend I handled the following weeks with any particular grace. I drove different routes when I could arrange it, and when I couldn't, I drove that stretch of 41 in the daylight, gripping the wheel a little tighter than necessary and not looking too hard at the shoulders. I didn't see anything else, but I didn't feel easy either. There was a weight to that particular mile of highway now that hadn't been there before, and some part of me, the honest part, had already started to understand what it might mean, even if I wasn't ready to say it out loud. Then came November. I had a run back up through that corridor on a night that was colder and darker than the October one had been. I was trying to stay steady, telling myself it had been a trick of the light, exhaustion, the particular way headlights can make a reflective road sign look like a human shape. I was passing the pull-out. The radio died again. This time I didn't touch it. I just sat up a little straighter and kept my eyes on the road and kept driving. And then the smell came, but stronger this time, much stronger, and mixed now with something else underneath it. Something older, the way an old church smells or a room that's been closed for too long. I was about a quarter mile past the pull-out when I saw the lights of another truck pulled over on the shoulder ahead of me. As I got closer, I recognized the rig, a blue Peterbilt I'd seen parked at the same fuel stop as me outside of Columbia a few times. The driver was a woman named Carol Suttles, who'd been running this corridor for longer than I had. We weren't close, but we knew each other the way people in this work know each other, by rig, by wave, by reputation. I pulled in behind her. She was standing outside her cab drinking from a thermos, and when she saw me climb down, she raised a hand in greeting. "Crawford," she said, "didn't expect company out here." "Just stopped to clear my head," I said, which was half true. We talked for a while about nothing in particular: loads, fuel prices, a section of I-65 that had been torn up for construction for what felt like the better part of civilization. And then, because something in me needed to say it out loud to another human being, I told her. The smell, the radio, the woman on the shoulder, the pull-out. I told her about the memorial flowers I'd stumbled over and hadn't properly fixed. Carol listened without interrupting, which is rarer than it should be. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, turning her thermos in both hands. "You know whose that is?" she said. "That memorial?" I told her I didn't. She nodded slowly. "Girl named Abigail Marsh, 19 years old. Happened maybe 6-7 years back now. She was driving home late from a shift at the diner where she worked over in Pulaski. Car broke down right about at that pullout, and she got out to try to walk for help. Driver coming through didn't see her in time." Carol paused. "Her mama put that memorial up about a week after. Comes out every few months to tend to it, replaces the flowers, keeps it clean, the purple and white ones. Those were her daughter's favorite colors." I stood there in the cold and felt the full weight of what I'd done settle over me. Not the stumbling exactly, that had been an accident. What I'd done was leave it. I'd looked at that little cluster of flowers in the dark, thought it's fine, and walked away. At a spot where a 19-year-old girl had died alone on a cold roadside, where her mother came faithfully to say, "I remember you, you mattered." "You think that's why—" I started. "I think," Carol said carefully, "that there are places on these roads that hold things. And I think that when we're careless with those places, sometimes we find out about it." She took a sip of her coffee. "I'm not going to tell you what I believe about what's possible and what isn't. That's between you and whatever you have faith in, but I'll tell you what I do." She told me to go back in the daylight, to fix the memorial properly, to say something. She didn't specify what. "Just say it honestly," she said. "That's all most people ever want, living or otherwise." I went back on a Saturday morning a week later. I brought a small hand spade, a pair of gloves, and 2 bunches of silk flowers I'd bought at a craft store in Decatur, purple and white, as close to what had been there as I could find. Linda had helped me pick them out, though I'd only told her part of the story, enough for her to understand why I needed them to be right. It was a grey morning, cold and still. The trees along 41 nearly bare by then, their last leaves collecting in the ditches along the shoulder. I parked at the pullout and sat in the truck for a minute before getting out. The memorial was small, a short white wooden cross, weathered but solid, driven into the ground a few feet back from the gravel. Around its base, someone had placed a ring of small white stones. The plastic stake I'd knocked loose was still there, tilted sideways in the dirt, the silk flowers it held crumpled and half buried. Beside them in the grass I could see the outline of where another stake had been, pulled clean from the ground probably when my boot caught them both, and I'd only noticed one. I spent about half an hour out there. I reset both stakes firmly, pressed deep into the soil. I replaced the old damaged flowers with the new ones. I cleared out the dead leaves and grass that had accumulated around the base of the cross. I straightened the ring of white stones that the seasons had scattered. And then I stood there, hat in my hands, and I talked to Abigail Marsh. I told her I was sorry. Not in the quick, reflexive way that people say it when they bump into each other in a grocery store aisle. I told her I was sorry the way you tell someone the truth, when you owe it to them plainly, fully, without trying to make yourself look better in the telling. I told her I had walked past her cross without stopping and that I had known in the back of my mind that it deserved better. I told her that I didn't know her, but that I had a daughter, and that if anything ever happened to my daughter, I would want someone to stop. I told her that from here on out, every time I drove this road, I would stop. The cold air moved through the bare trees. I don't know what I expected. I suppose some part of me was waiting for something, a sign, a sensation, some confirmation that the words had landed somewhere. What I got instead was something quieter than that. A feeling of the air settling, maybe. The particular stillness that comes just after you've said something that needed saying. I put my hat back on, picked up my tools, and walked back to the truck. I've been driving Highway 41 for years since that morning, and I have kept my promise. Every time I pass that spot, day or night, loaded or empty, running ahead or running late, I pull onto that gravel shoulder and I stop for a few minutes. If the flowers need replacing, I replace them. If the cross needs straightening, I straighten it. Once in the spring, I arrived to find that someone else had already been there. Fresh flowers, a small laminated photograph tucked against the base of the cross, a girl with dark hair smiling at a birthday cake. Abigail's mother, I imagine, or someone who loved her. I've never seen the woman on the shoulder of the road again. The radio has never cut out on that stretch again, and the smell, the sweet, rotten, grieving smell of old flowers has never come back. I think about her sometimes when I'm out on a long night run. The way you think about people who've affected you even when you've never properly met them. A 19-year-old girl who just wanted to get home from her shift. A mother who drives out to a stretch of highway to lay flowers at the place where her daughter's life ended so that the world doesn't forget entirely. And a careless middle-aged truck driver who tripped over those flowers in the dark and walked away and eventually came back. I've talked to a few of my colleagues about this over the years, and I found that nearly every long-haul driver on rural roads has a story from a stretch of highway that sits a little differently than the rest. A mile that feels heavier, a spot where your animals get uneasy, where your radio behaves strangely, where you find yourself reaching for your coffee or turning up your music without quite knowing why. I don't think these places are trying to frighten us, not exactly. I think they're asking something simpler. Pay attention, slow down. Remember that someone was here. We move fast in this life, those of us who drive for a living. We cover enormous distances. We pass through hundreds of places in a single week, and most of them blur together into a continuous ribbon of asphalt and white lines and mile markers. It is very easy in that blur to stop seeing the small things at the roadside, the faded crosses, the plastic flowers in colors that someone chose carefully and deliberately, the small, stubborn declarations of grief that families leave at the places where they lost someone, in the hope that strangers passing at 70 miles an hour will somehow understand that this piece of highway is not just pavement, it is a grave of a kind. I understand that now. I understood it the hard way, which seems to be the only way some lessons come. My name is Daniel Wayne Crawford. I'm from Decatur, Tennessee, and I have driven nearly 2 million miles in this country. I have seen its plains and its mountains and its swamps and its forests, all of them from the high seat of a cab at all hours of the day and night. I have watched the sun rise over the Appalachians and set over the Alabama flatlands more times than I can count. And every time I drive south on Highway 41 through that stretch between Pulaski and Lawrenceburg, I pull over at a wide gravel shoulder just past a curve in the road, and I get out and I stand for a moment by a small white cross with purple and white flowers at its feet, and I say hello to a girl I never knew. It's the least I can do, even if I had it coming. The last patient in room 9. I've been asked more than once why I still work the night shift after everything that happened. My honest answer is that I don't sleep well anymore regardless, so I might as well be useful. But the real reason, the one I never say out loud, is that I keep waiting to understand what I saw. 10 years have passed and I'm still waiting. My name is Calvin Mercer. I'm a respiratory therapist from Covington, Kentucky, and I've worked in clinical settings for going on 15 years now. I want to be clear about something before I tell you any of this. I am not a superstitious man. I grew up in a household where my father was an engineer and my mother was a pharmacist. My entire childhood was built on the idea that things have explanations, that the world runs on systems, and that fear is mostly just ignorance wearing a mask. I believe that with every cell in my body, right up until the autumn of 2014, when I worked 3 weeks at St. Ambrose Memorial Hospital in Cincinnati, Ohio, and came home a different person than the one who had left. It started the way most terrible things do, quietly, and with something so small you almost dismiss it. I had been brought in as a traveling specialist to cover a staffing shortage in the pulmonology ward. It was a temporary contract, 3 weeks, maybe 4, depending on patient volume, and I was staying at a corporate extended stay hotel about 7 minutes from the hospital. I didn't know the permanent staff well yet, but I had already formed a decent working relationship with a nurse named Deirdre Walsh, a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her late 40s who had worked that floor for 11 years and knew every protocol by heart. She was the kind of colleague you feel lucky to find, competent, unflappable, and honest in the way that experienced nurses sometimes are, which is to say she told you the truth even when it was uncomfortable. On my 4th night, Deirdre pulled me aside near the medication cart and told me almost casually, the way you might mention that the elevator on the east wing was running slow, that I should try not to spend too much time near room 9. Is there an infectious concern? I asked. It was the only logical interpretation. She shook her head. No, just trust me. Do your rounds, do what you need to do, but don't linger there. I wanted to press her for more, but a call light went off down the hall and she was gone before I could ask anything else. I filed it away as one of those odd interpersonal quirks that every long-term ward develops. Some rooms become associated with difficult cases, with patients who died badly, and the staff builds small superstitions around them as a kind of emotional armor. I respected that. I left it alone. Room 9 was at the far end of the corridor, the last door on the right before the hallway bent toward the service stairwell. On paper it was identical to the other rooms, 2 beds, 1 window, standard monitoring equipment, but I noticed on that same 4th night during my first official pass that the room was occupied by only one patient, an elderly man named Harold Price, 78 years old, admitted for a pulmonary embolism, and that the second bed was stripped bare of everything. No pillow, no blanket, not even a mattress cover, just the metal frame sitting there like something that had been emptied in a hurry. I completed Harold's respiratory assessment without incident. He was sedated and stable, but as I was updating his chart near the doorway, I noticed something that made me pause. The room had a particular quality to it that I couldn't immediately name. It wasn't cold, the temperature was the same as the rest of the floor. It wasn't the smell, it was something about the silence. Every hospital room has a baseline sound, the hum of equipment, the distant murmur of the ward, the rhythm of a ventilator if one is present. Room 9 had all of that, and yet it felt profoundly, almost deliberately quiet. Like the silence in a room after an argument has just ended. I told myself I was tired. I went back to the nursing station. The first genuinely unexplainable thing happened on night 6. I was in the supply corridor that ran parallel to the patient rooms, pulling a spare nebulizer from the storage cart, when I heard something through the wall that shared a boundary with room 9. At first I thought it was a television. Some patients asked to have sets brought in, but the sound had no rhythm to it, no cadence of dialogue or music. It was repetitive and low, and the more I strained to identify it, the more certain I became that it was a voice. Not Harold Price's voice. I knew his voice, hoarse and thin from his illness. This was something else, a woman's voice, murmuring. I stepped back into the main corridor and walked to room 9. Harold was asleep, exactly as I had left him. The second bed was still bare. The room was empty except for him. There was no television, no radio, no phone placed near enough to the wall to account for what I'd heard. I stood at the threshold for a long moment, listening. Nothing. Only the ventilator and the quiet. I mentioned it to Deirdre the next morning during the overlap between shifts. She listened without any readable expression on her face, then asked me which wall the sound seemed to come from. I pointed in the direction of the empty second bed. She nodded once very slowly and said, "Try not to go back in there unless Harold needs you." Deirdre, what happened in that room? She looked at me for a long moment, then she said, "Nothing I can prove." That sentence stayed with me all day. I want to tell you about Harold Price for a moment because he matters to this story more than it might seem. He was a retired geography teacher from a small town in southern Ohio. He had a daughter who visited every other afternoon and brought him crossword puzzle books. He was polite and clear-minded despite his condition, and on the rare occasions when he was awake during my rounds, he would ask me thoughtful questions about how the respiratory equipment worked, the way someone does when they genuinely want to understand the world around them. I liked him immediately. On night 8, Harold was having a difficult time. His oxygen saturation had dipped during the early part of the evening, and I was monitoring him more closely than usual. Around 2 in the morning, when things had stabilized, I was sitting in the chair near his bed updating my records when he opened his eyes and looked at the empty bed across the room. "She's here again," he said. His voice was completely calm. "I'm sorry?" "The woman. She comes at night." He turned and looked at me with clear, lucid eyes. "Does she bother you too?" I set my clipboard down very carefully. "Mr. Price, what woman?" "I don't know her name. She doesn't talk to me." He paused. "She mostly just stands there. Sometimes she touches the bed frame." He said all of this with the matter-of-fact ease of someone describing a neighbor who waved at them from across the street. I figured she was a nurse I hadn't met yet, but her clothes are wrong for that. I asked him to describe what she was wearing. He thought about it for a moment and said she wore something dark and long, and that she was old, very old, and that her hands were what he noticed most. She always had her hands out in front of her, he said, as if she were feeling around for something she couldn't find. I told Harold I would look into it. I turned off his overhead light, made sure his call button was within reach, and walked directly to the nursing station to find Deirdre. She wasn't there. Her replacement, a younger nurse named Tobias, told me she had gone on break. I waited. 20 minutes passed and she didn't return. When I checked the break room, it was empty. I didn't see Deirdre again until the following evening. What I did instead, and I've questioned this decision more times than I can count, was go back to room 9 alone. I don't know what I expected to find. Harold was asleep again by then. The room was still. I stood just inside the doorway and looked at the empty bed, at the bare metal frame, at the window beyond it where the orange-grey light of the city pressed against the glass. Nothing was out of place, nothing moved. And then, and I will never be fully certain of the sequence because my mind was working hard to rationalize what my senses were receiving, I became aware that the air near the empty bed was different. Not colder. Denser maybe is the closest word I have. Like the feeling in a room where many people have stood for a long time. And I heard it again, that low, repetitive murmur. Not coming through the wall this time, coming from directly in front of me. I took a step back, then another. My heel caught the door frame and I grabbed it to steady myself, and as I did I felt something graze the back of my left hand, sharp, deliberate, like the edge of a fingernail dragged slowly across skin. I pulled my hand back and looked at it in the dim light. 3 parallel lines, red and rising, ran from my knuckle to my wrist, not deep enough to bleed, but unmistakable. I got out of that room. I found the nearest restroom, ran cold water over my hand and stood there gripping the edge of the sink for a long time, breathing the way you breathe when your body is trying to convince itself that everything is fine. When I looked in the mirror, I made myself hold eye contact with my own reflection and say, out loud, in a normal voice, "There is an explanation for this." I said it the way my father used to say it, with authority. I'm not sure I believed it. The following night, Deirdre finally told me what she knew. We were in the break room alone, the door closed. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup the way people do when they need something solid to hold on to, and she told me that room 9 had held, 18 months earlier, a patient named Vera Holloway, 91 years old, admitted for end-stage respiratory failure with no family on record and no emergency contacts of any kind. Vera Holloway had been, according to the hospital's intake social worker, a woman with a complicated history. There had been notes in her file about legal disputes, estrangements, rumors from her referring physician in the rural county where she'd lived about unusual activities that nobody had been willing to specify in writing. Vera Holloway had died in room 9 in the second bed on a Tuesday morning in March, alone, without a single visitor during her entire 3-week admission. After she passed, Deirdre said carefully, things started happening in that room, not all at once, gradually. She set down her coffee. Equipment malfunctions that couldn't be explained. A student nurse who refused to go back in after her first solo round. Then Marcus. Who's Marcus? She was quiet for a moment. He was a travel therapist, like you. He was here for a month before you arrived. She stopped again. Deirdre. He had a cardiac event, she said quietly. In room 9, he was 29 years old and had no prior cardiac history. He survived barely. He transferred to a facility near his home, and I haven't heard from him since. She looked at me across the table. I should have told you on your first night. I'm sorry. I asked her why she hadn't. She said she wasn't sure anyone would believe her, and that she had halfway convinced herself it was coincidence. I asked her why the hospital kept the room in rotation instead of taking it offline. She gave me the kind of look that said the answer was obvious, because a hospital with a fully operational ward doesn't explain to its administrators that a bed is unusable due to paranormal events, because there is no form for that. We agreed that evening that I would document everything I had experienced. We agreed that until my contract ended, I would perform only the minimum necessary interactions with room 9, brief, efficient, never alone when possible. 3 days later, Harold Price was transferred to a step-down unit on a different floor. His condition had improved significantly. The morning after his transfer, I went to room 9 during daylight hours, which felt important for reasons I didn't fully analyze, and I stood in the middle of the room and looked at everything. The bare second bed, the window, the walls, the monitoring equipment that nobody was connected to. The room felt ordinary, neutral, like a room that had been recently vacated. But on the floor beside the empty bed frame, I noticed something I hadn't seen in any of my previous visits. A set of marks on the linoleum, parallel lines, evenly spaced, grouped in threes, running along the edge of the bed's metal leg from the floor upwards, as though something had been dragging its fingers slowly up the side of it for a very long time. The pattern was the same as the marks on my hand. My contract ended 4 days later. I completed my exit paperwork, returned my access badge, and drove back to Covington without stopping. I called Deirdre once, about 2 weeks after I left, to check in. She told me that the floor had requested room 9 be taken out of rotation for renovations. She said the request had been approved. She said she didn't know when or whether it would be put back into use. She also told me, and her voice was careful, and even when she said it, the way a person's voice is when they're trying to keep something contained, that the day after I left, the housekeeping staff had found the bare mattress from the second bed moved to the center of the room. Nobody had ordered it moved. Nobody admitted to having moved it. I thanked her and told her to take care of herself. I still think about Harold Price sometimes. I think about him waking in the night in a hospital room and describing, in that quiet and reasonable voice, a woman with her hands stretched out in front of her, searching. Not frightened by it, just noting it, the way you note something you've grown accustomed to. I've wondered since then what Vera Holloway was looking for, whether she found it in whatever it was she did to Marcus, or in the marks she left on my hand, or in those long grooves worn into the metal frame of the bed she died in. I've wondered whether she found it at all, or whether she's still in there, methodical and patient in the dark, feeling along every surface of that room with her terrible hands. I don't know the answer to that. I don't think I want to, but I will tell you this. Whenever I'm assigned a room at the far end of a corridor, the last door before the hallway turns, I do my job, and I do it well, and I don't linger. I've learned that much at least, unknown. There's a saying I've heard more times than I can count, usually from people who think they're being profound. The more you know, the more you realize how little you know. Most folks just nod along to that and move on with their coffee. But I've been turning that phrase over in my hands for years now, like a stone you pull from a riverbed, smooth on one side, sharp enough to cut on the other. Because there's a version of that truth that nobody talks about, a darker version. It isn't just about knowledge, and it isn't about science or books or what you studied in school. It's about the terrifying possibility that there are things sharing this world with us, things that have been here longer than we have, maybe watching us the way we watch fish in a tank. Patient, curious, entirely indifferent to whether or not we notice them back. I want you to hold on to that idea while I tell you what happened to me. My name is Thomas Calloway. Most people call me Tom. I'm a game warden for the state of Montana. Been doing this work for going on 19 years. Before you picture some guy sitting in a ranger station reading paperbacks, let me correct that image. Game wardens in this part of the country cover territories the size of small European nations. On any given night, I might be 40 miles from the nearest cell tower, alone in the dark, checking on a reported poaching site or investigating livestock interference in areas that border federal wilderness land. My wife Karen and our 2 kids, our daughter Lily, who was 16 at the time this started, and our son Dex, who was 13, live in a house on the edge of a small town called Dwyer, population somewhere around 800, if you count the people who only show up for hunting season. I love this life. I chose it. I want you to understand that, because what I'm about to tell you isn't the complaint of a man who resented his circumstances. I was exactly where I wanted to be. I just had no idea what else was out there with me. It started in late September, which in Montana means the aspens have already gone gold, and the nights come down cold and fast like a curtain being dropped. I'd been getting reports for about 3 weeks from 2 different ranchers' unrelated properties, separated by roughly 30 miles of federal land, describing the same thing. Cattle found dead in the open field, no signs of predator activity, no tracks, no blood. The animals were opened up, but cleanly, surgically, if I'm being precise. Internal organs removed with a precision that no coyote or mountain lion is capable of. The first rancher, a man named Gerald Pruitt, who I'd known for a decade, called me out to his property on a Tuesday morning and stood there in his field pointing at the 3rd animal he'd lost in 2 weeks. And the look on his face wasn't grief exactly. It was something closer to the expression you might wear if someone had just told you a rule you'd lived your whole life by turned out to be wrong. He wasn't sad. He was unsteady. I filed the reports. I took photographs. I told Gerald and the other rancher, a woman named Pat Sorensen, that I'd be increasing my patrol frequency through that corridor. I believed at the time that there was a rational explanation waiting to be found. Maybe a group of individuals with some kind of motive I hadn't yet identified. Maybe something I'd never encountered before, but explainable, natural. That was still the world I was living in. The night everything changed, I was running a late patrol through the valley between the two properties. It was a Thursday, just after 2 in the morning. Clear sky, no moon to speak of, and the stars out here on a night like that are so dense and so bright that you develop a strange feeling looking at them. Not comfort exactly, but scale. You feel the size of things. My truck, a 19 F250 with about 140,000 miles on it, was the only light source moving through about 15 miles of open terrain. I had the window cracked because even in the cold I prefer some fresh air on long night drives. It keeps me sharp. I noticed the temperature change first. I want to be careful how I describe this because I've spent a lot of time trying to find the right words, and I still don't feel like I've gotten there. It wasn't that the air inside the cab got warmer the way it does when you turn the heater up. It was different. More like the air itself changed composition somehow, became thicker, heavier in my lungs. The kind of warmth that isn't comfortable. Like the feeling you get standing too close to an industrial machine that's been running for hours. I turned the heater off. The temperature kept rising. Then the sound started. I've read accounts from other people describing this, and they always call it a hum or a vibration. And yes, that's part of it. But what struck me most was that it wasn't coming from any single direction. It seemed to originate from inside my own skull, the way a sound feels when you're standing directly beneath a power line. My fillings ached. That's the most specific way I can describe it, a deep resonant pressure that registered in the metal in my teeth. My truck began to slow. I wasn't touching the brake. My foot was still steady on the accelerator. The engine didn't sputter or cough, didn't give any of the familiar signals of a mechanical failure. It simply lost power in a way I can only describe as deliberate. Like something external was pulling the electricity out of it, the way you drain water from a bathtub. Within about 30 seconds, I was at a complete stop in the middle of a dirt service road, engine off, total darkness except for the stars. I sat there for a moment, both hands on the wheel, running through rational explanations. Electrical fault, some kind of interference. I reached for my radio and found it dead. My phone showed full bars but wouldn't connect to anything. The silence outside was complete in a way that silence is out here almost never. No wind, no animal sounds, nothing. Just that low internal pressure of the hum. I turned on my flashlight, a heavy-duty mag light I keep between the seats, and swept it through the windows. On the left side of the road, nothing. On the right, open field extending back toward a tree line about 200 yards out. I pointed the light forward down the road. There was something on the ground about 50 feet ahead of me. My first thought, I'll be honest with you, was that it was another dead cow. Given everything I'd been investigating, that was the logical assumption. I grabbed my flashlight, my sidearm out of habit, and pushed open the door. The moment my boots hit the ground, the hum stopped. The temperature dropped back to normal, cold and sharp and clean. I stood there for a few seconds in the sudden silence, trying to decide if that transition was a relief or if it was something worse than the hum. I decided after a moment that it was something worse. I approached the shape in the road carefully. It was in fact a calf, young, couldn't have been more than a few months old, and it was in the same condition as the others, same absence of blood, same surgical precision, same impossible emptiness where its organs should have been. I stood over it for a while, flashlight trained on it, trying to get my professional brain to engage and override the part of me that was screaming at a frequency I wasn't fully hearing yet. Then I heard something above me, not on the ground, not in the tree line, above me, a sound I can only describe as a wet shifting, like something repositioning its weight on a surface that wasn't quite solid. I moved the flashlight upward. I have a daughter. I told you that, Lily. When she was about 4 years old, she went through a phase the way kids do, where she'd curl herself into the tightest possible ball in her bed, and you could walk into her room at night and in the dark she'd look exactly like a pile of laundry or a shadow until she moved. That's what I thought for one fraction of a second when the beam of my flashlight landed on what was crouched on the roof of my truck. I thought it was a child, curled in on itself, knees drawn up, arms wrapped around its own legs. Then it turned its head toward the light. I'm going to try to describe this accurately because I've had a long time to replay it, and I owe you the clearest account I'm capable of giving. The proportions were wrong in a way that took a moment to register because each individual feature, in isolation, almost made sense. Almost. It was roughly the size of a 10-year-old child in terms of height, but the shoulders were broader than they should have been, adult-wide, strangely muscular, and the arms, when it slowly began to extend them as it stood upright, were far too long. They reached past its knees and still going. It moved them slightly as it stood, not frantically, not aggressively, but in the way a person might flex their fingers before picking something up. It had no hair. Its skin, in the flashlight beam, was a color I don't have a clean name for, a deep gray-green, the color of old pine bark after rain, and it was wet, or not wet exactly but coated in something, a film, a thin viscous layer that caught the light and threw it back dimly, like the surface of still water. I could see the shape of something structural beneath the skin. Not bones exactly, but suggested geometries that weren't human geometries. It looked at me. I know it looked at me because something in me knew it was looking at me, even though I could not, in that light, at that distance, make out what its eyes looked like. I just felt the attention. The way you feel a camera on you in a room before you see it. I did not run. I want to be clear that I made a rational decision not to run, because every training instinct I've developed over 19 years in the field tells you that running activates a pursuit response in things that hunt. I stood completely still. I held the light on it, and it stood completely still in return, its two long arms hanging open at its sides, its broad, wrong shoulders perfectly level. We stayed like that for what felt like a very long time, then the sky lit up. There is no other way to describe it. The entire sky in every direction went from black to something close to noon white in less than a second. Not from a single point source, not like lightning, uniformly like a light switch thrown on for the entire atmosphere. I covered my eyes with my forearm. The light lasted no more than 2 or 3 seconds. When it died, I lowered my arm and opened my eyes. The creature was gone. The calf was gone. My truck was sitting exactly where I'd left it, driver's door still open, and the sky was full of stars and nothing else. I drove home. I know that I drove home because I woke up the next morning in my own bed, in my own clothes, with my boots still on, and dried mud on the soles from the service road. Karen was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs. She looked at me the way she does when she thinks I've been pushing myself too hard. A particular look I know well after 22 years, and she asked if I'd gotten any sleep at all out on patrol. I told her I'd caught a few hours in the truck. I didn't mention anything else. I sat down at the table and drank my coffee and stared at the grain of the wood and tried to decide if I was a person who was still in possession of his own sanity. I was not prepared for it to happen again. 6 weeks later, different road, different part of the district, 40-some miles from the first location. The heat came first again, and the pressure in my teeth, and the truck went dark and quiet in that same deliberate, draining way. This time there was no animal in the road. I knew better now than to get out. I stayed in my seat, windows up, and I waited. It appeared on the hood. It didn't drop down from above, or at least I didn't see it arrive. It was simply not there, and then it was, standing on the hood of my truck with its weight distributed in a way that should have dented the metal but didn't, facing the windshield, facing me. And this time, close enough and with a clear enough angle I could see its face. I don't use the word face lightly. I'm using it because I don't have a better word, and not because what I saw resembled a face in any way I was prepared for. The coating, that film I mentioned, covered everything. Where a nose might have been, there was only a slight raised ridge. No ears that I could identify. No hair. The eyes, and I have to call them eyes because they were in the approximate location where eyes would be, were disproportionately large and entirely without the white that human eyes have. Dark, uniform, and slightly convex, like two stones set into the surface of the face. They caught the light from my truck's interior and threw back no reflection. None. I've thought about that detail many times since. Every surface reflects something. These didn't. Its mouth, and again I use the word for lack of a better one, was nearly invisible when closed. Just a seam. But as I watched, it opened. Not the way a human mouth opens, hinged and proportional. It opened from the center outward, splitting in 4 directions simultaneously, and what was inside wasn't darkness. It was movement. I could see things moving in there, fine and rapid, too small to resolve in the dim light, like watching something under a microscope that won't stop moving long enough to focus on. I don't know what they were, I don't know what any of it was. I just know that my hand, which had been resting on my thigh, found the door handle entirely without my permission, and I had to consciously override my own body's decision to get out of the truck and run. The creature raised one of those long arms and pressed the flat of its palm, 3 elongated fingers, no thumb, joined at a membrane near the base against the glass of my windshield. Where it touched, the glass fogged immediately, a white condensation blooming outward from the contact point. Then the sky went white again, even through closed eyes, even with my hands pressed over my face. The sound that came with it was beyond sound, it was pressure, pure and total, and I heard myself shouting but couldn't hear my voice. And then I was in my driveway, engine running, 3:47 in the morning, 43 minutes unaccounted for. I know it's been 2 years now. I know that because Lily is 18 and leaving for college next fall, and Dex is 15 and already 2 inches taller than me, and I have laid awake more nights than I can count just trying to reach back into the gap where those missing minutes are and finding nothing there. Not darkness, not confusion, just absence like a page torn out. I've told one person about this, a colleague of mine, Dr. Alan Marsh, who teaches environmental biology at the State University and who I've worked with on wildlife studies for years. Alan is not a person given to dramatic conclusions. He listened to everything I told him, asked several very precise questions, and then sat quietly for a while. When he spoke, he said that the pattern I was describing, the electromagnetic interference, the physiological effects, the missing time, the conjunction with animal mutilation activity in the same geographic corridor was consistent with a phenomenon that had been reported and documented in that region, and in regions like it for decades. He said the word reported very carefully. Not explained. Reported. There is one thing left to tell you, and it is the part that I have turned over the most. The part that changes the shape of everything else. About 3 months after the second encounter, I was sitting at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning, and I made the mistake of mentioning to Karen offhand, as if I were talking about a recurring dream that I'd been having episodes lately where I'd lose track of time, gaps, the kind where you look at the clock and more time has passed than you can account for. I told her it was probably fatigue. She'd been watching me for a while across the table the way she does, and when I finished, she set down her mug. She said, "Tom, you've always had those." I told her I didn't know what she meant. She said, "Since before we were married. I used to worry about it. Remember when we drove to Billings for your cousin's wedding and you lost about 2 hours somewhere outside Roundup? You told me you must have gone on autopilot. I thought you might have a sleep condition." She paused. "It used to happen every few weeks. It's actually been less frequent the last couple of years." I sat with that for a long time. The thing I've been turning over, the thing I started telling you about at the beginning is this. We talk about the unknown as if it's out there somewhere, past the edges of what we can see, as if it has the decency to stay at a distance. But what if it doesn't? What if some of the things we can't explain aren't out on the horizon at all, but close? Closer than we're comfortable imagining? What if some of them have been paying attention to you for a lot longer than you know? I still go out on patrol, I still drive those roads, I still love this work and this landscape and my family and this life I chose, but I want you to understand something. I look up now. Whenever I'm out there alone in the dark, before I look at the road, before I look at the tree line, before I check anything else, I look up. Because whatever is out there already knows where I am. I'm just now starting to understand that it always did. The Hummingbird Road. I want to be upfront about something before you read further. I'm not a superstitious man. 22 years in the United States Army will do that to you. You stop believing in luck, in signs, in anything you can't field strip and reassemble. You believe in protocol, in chain of command, in what your eyes and hands can confirm. And that's the man I was when I arrived at the small forward operating base outside a village called Puente Seco, in the mountains of a country I was told I'd love and leave quickly. I did not leave quickly. My name is irrelevant. What matters is my rank at the Times, Staff Sergeant, and my assignment, perimeter security oversight during a 3-week joint training operation. We were there to work alongside local military units, nothing glamorous, mostly logistics and communication drills. The base was modest, 12 soldiers total, a small medical tent, a generator that hummed like it was always arguing with itself, and a gravel road that cut through the jungle for about 4 kilometers before reaching the main highway. That road is what this story is about. The first time I heard about it was 3 days after arrival. I was cleaning my sidearm outside the barracks when a local soldier named Castano sat down on the opposite crate without asking permission. I'd learned enough of the language to hold a basic conversation, and Castano spoke enough English to confuse the rest. "You know about the road at night?" he asked, lighting a cigarette with the calm of a man who had already accepted some terrible thing. "I drive it every morning," I said. He nodded slowly, as if confirming a suspicion he'd hoped was wrong. "In the day it is a road. At night," he paused, exhaled, "it is something else." I didn't press him. I'd heard that kind of talk from locals in other deployments. Every place has its legend, its monster, its forbidden hour. You smile, you nod, you go to sleep. But I did notice that not a single local soldier ever volunteered for night patrol along the Hummingbird Road, which was what they called it, though I never saw a hummingbird there, not once. I filed that detail in the back of my mind and left it there, where harmless things live. That arrangement lasted exactly 9 days. On the 10th night, Private Dolan came to find me at 0140 hours, and he was 23 years old from somewhere flat in the Midwest, and he had a face that still believed the world was mostly reasonable. That face, when he ducked into my quarters, had changed into something I recognized from worse places, the expression a person wears when they've seen something their brain has not yet agreed to classify. "Sergeant," he said and stopped. "Dolan, I need you to come outside." I didn't ask why. The tone handled that. He led me to the eastern edge of the perimeter, where the gravel road disappeared into darkness between the trees. Private Okonkwo was already there, standing very still in a way that told me he hadn't moved in several minutes, not out of discipline, but out of the specific paralysis that grips a person when they're afraid that moving will confirm something. "Tell me," I said. Okonkwo pointed without looking. "It's been standing there for 11 minutes. I counted." I looked down the road. At first I saw nothing. The generator's light reached maybe 30 meters before the jungle swallowed everything, but then, at the very edge of that light, at the precise border between illuminated gravel and dark vegetation, I made out the shape. It was a figure, standing in the middle of the road. My immediate assessment was practical. Civilian, probably disoriented, possibly intoxicated or in medical distress. The nearest village was 8 kilometers away, but people wander. It happens. I reached for the flashlight on my belt and raised it. The beam found the figure, and I wish I have wished many times since that I had not turned it on. It was a woman. She appeared elderly, though the distance made precision difficult. She wore a long dark dress that reached the ground, and her hair was loose and pale, falling over her shoulders in a way that the slight jungle breeze touched but didn't disturb the way hair should be disturbed. What held my attention, and what I am going to describe as accurately as I can, was her posture. She was not standing the way people stand. Her weight was distributed incorrectly. Both arms hung too far forward, slightly bent at the elbow, palms facing back toward her body. Her head was angled to the right at a degree that would have been uncomfortable to maintain for more than a few seconds. But she held it, and she was looking directly at us. "Ma'am," I called out in the local language, "this is a restricted military installation. Please identify yourself and state if you require assistance." She didn't respond. She didn't move. "Sergeant," Dolan said quietly behind me. "She was there when I started my shift. I thought she was a postmarker at first, then she wasn't in the same position." I processed that. "Get Castano," I said. Castano arrived within 2 minutes, still tucking in his shirt. He took one look down the road, and his entire body changed the way a structure changes when a load-bearing element is suddenly removed. He became small. I'd never seen anything make Castano small. "Tell me what you know about this," I said. He crossed himself. He was not a particularly religious man. I'd heard him blaspheme creatively in 2 languages, so the gesture landed with weight. "We call her La Viajera," he said, "the traveler. She comes to the road when—" He stopped, reconsidered. "There are things I am not supposed to talk about to outsiders, but you should go back inside now, Sergeant, all of you." "I'm not going back inside based on local superstition," I said. "If that's a civilian, we have a duty of care. If it's a threat, we assess and respond. Those are the 2 options." Castano looked at me with an expression I can only describe as the look of a man watching someone walk confidently toward a river that has no bottom. "Then I will come with you," he said quietly. We walked down the road, Castano, Okonkwo, and myself. I ordered Dolan to stay at the perimeter and maintain radio contact. I had my flashlight in one hand and my sidearm holstered, which is the kind of detail that feels embarrassing to mention in retrospect because nothing I was carrying had any relevance to what was waiting for us. At 20 meters, the woman was still motionless. At 15, I could see her face properly for the first time, and I'm going to choose my words here with care because I don't want to sound like a man performing a ghost story. What I saw was not monstrous in the way a special effects team would design monstrous. It was wrong in a structural sense, the way a sentence can be grammatically correct and still mean nothing. Her face was a face, 2 eyes, a nose, a mouth, but the proportions were slightly off in ways I couldn't individually catalog, only sense as a whole. The way you sense a room has been rearranged before you can identify what moved. Her eyes caught the flashlight and reflected it back, not the way eyes reflect light, but the way glass does. Beside me, Castano had stopped walking. "She is deciding," he whispered. "Deciding what?" He didn't answer. The woman's head, which had been angled to the right, slowly corrected itself. She looked at us straight on, then she smiled. "I have been in combat. I have been close enough to death on 3 separate occasions to give it a biography. I know what fear feels like when it is rational and purposeful, the kind that sharpens you. This was not that. This was something that arrived underneath the fear, below the floor of every trained response I had, and it operated on something older than my training. My legs did not stop working, but they sent up a very honest message about their preferences. Okonkwo made a sound, not a word, a sound, involuntary, the kind a person makes when their body reports something before their mind can formulate a description. The woman on the road raised her right hand. She was holding something. It took me a moment to identify it because my flashlight beam had begun, inexplicably, to dim, not flicker, not fail, but simply produce less light than the moment before, as if the darkness had a claim on it. What she held appeared to be a bundle of something dark and organic, tied together. Dried plants or roots, bound with what looked like black cord. She set it on the road in front of her. Then she stepped backward into the tree line and was gone. Not gone like a person walking away. Gone like a word you forget mid-sentence. One moment she occupied space and then she did not, and the tree line beyond was absolutely still. We stood there for a while. I don't know how long. Castano was the first to speak. "Don't touch it," he said. "I wasn't planning to. I mean any of you, ever, don't go near it." I looked at him. The flashlight had returned to full strength the moment she disappeared, which I noted and did not discuss. "What is it?" "A warning," he said, "or an invitation. With her, the difference depends on who receives it." He told me, walking back to the base, what he knew. He spoke quietly, without drama, which made it worse. La Viajera was not a legend in the village the way stories are legends, entertaining, imprecise, belonging to the past. She was a present tense fact that the village managed the same way you manage an aggressive animal that lives nearby. With awareness, with specific protocols, with the understanding that certain behaviors invite attention and others do not. She appeared, he said, at times of transition, when something was about to end or begin. She had been seen before the flooding of 1987 that destroyed a portion of the valley. She had been seen the week before a local man named Eligio Cruz left his family and was never located. She had been seen the night before Castano's own uncle died in an accident that no one could satisfactorily explain. "She doesn't cause these things," Castano said carefully. "She just knows about them before they happen. And sometimes she tries to say something. The bundle, that means someone in the group she's looking at is carrying something that doesn't belong to them. I am a man of reason. I want to be clear about that even now. But I also believe in taking all available information seriously when lives may depend on it. And something in the way Castano delivered this flat, evidential, without seeking my belief made me file it differently than folklore. Carrying something that doesn't belong to them, I repeated. What does that mean? It can mean many things, he said. A secret, a stolen object, a promise broken to someone important, something borrowed from a world that wants it back. I did not sleep well that night. I also did not report the incident formally, which I want to acknowledge as a professional failing, though the formal report would have read as either a security breach by an unidentified civilian or the documented onset of a psychological episode, and neither served anyone. What I did was think about the people on that base, 12 soldiers, and a bundle left in the road for one of us. I reviewed what I knew about each man over the following 2 days, the way you review a map you think you've memorized. On the surface, everything normal. Deployment stress, homesickness, the specific tedium of training operations. Nothing that flagged. On the third day after the road, Specialist Harik asked me if we could speak privately. Harik was 31, a signals operator, 9 years in the service, quiet, methodical, the kind of man who recalibrates equipment twice when once is sufficient, not from anxiety but from discipline. I respected him specifically because he never asked for private conversations. It was not his register. We walked to the far side of the vehicle depot where the generator noise covered us. "I have to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to hear it as a soldier first and as a person second." I nodded. What he told me I will summarize because the details belong to him and to the family he wronged, not to this account. The short version: 3 months before deployment, Harik had discovered that a fellow soldier, a man who had since left the service, had been systematically stealing from the battalion's equipment fund. Small amounts, consistently, over 14 months. The total was significant. Harik had been approached subtly to look the other way in exchange for a portion. He had not taken the money. But he had not reported what he knew. He had simply kept the secret, told himself the other man was gone and the accounting would eventually catch it, and tried to forget. "I've been thinking about it since we got here," he said. "Something about this place. I can't sleep. I keep running it back." He paused. "And 2 nights ago I saw something on the road. I was heading to the latrine at about 0200. I don't know what I saw, but it looked at me. And I knew right then that it knew about the money." I held the silence between us for a moment. "You understand that you need to report what you know," I said. "Yes." "And you understand there will be consequences?" "Yes." "Then that's what you're going to do, when we return." He looked at me with the particular relief of a man who has been carrying something very heavy and has finally been given permission to set it down. "I know," he said, "I know, I just needed someone here to know I was going to." Harik reported the theft when we returned to base stateside. The investigation was lengthy. The soldier who had taken the money had already been discharged but was prosecuted regardless. Harik received an official reprimand for failing to report at the time of discovery, which he accepted without protest. I learned later from Castano through a letter he sent me several months after the deployment. The man wrote letters which I respected, that the bundle on the road had been removed by an elder from the village who apparently knew the protocol for such things. It was burned, he wrote. That was the correct procedure. The road, he said, had been quiet since. I've thought often about what the rational account of those events looks like. A disoriented or mentally ill woman on a rural road. A private's guilty conscience creating a convenient supernatural frame. Flashlight batteries that were simply aging. All of that holds together, technically. But here's the thing I keep returning to. The thing that doesn't fit cleanly in the rational account. Harik came to me one day after I had reviewed every member of our unit looking for exactly what he told me. And he told me without any visible external prompt. And the word Castano had used, carrying something that doesn't belong to them, described precisely the situation of a man sitting on knowledge that belonged to the army, not to him. I'm not asking you to believe in ghosts, I'm not sure I do. But I've spent a long time thinking about whether there are things in the world that are sensitive to human moral states, the way instruments are sensitive to frequency, that register what we carry before we finish deciding to carry it and find ways to make it visible because nothing hidden wants to stay hidden forever. The jungle, I think, has a longer memory than we do. I no longer take the night for granted wherever I am, and when I am somewhere unfamiliar and someone local tells me that a certain road has a different character after dark, I smile and I nod, and then I listen to what they say next, very carefully, and I believe them, the one who never let go. I still don't fully understand why I'm telling this story now, after all these years. Maybe it's because my daughter asked me recently if I believed in life after death, and I realized that my answer, without a single doubt or hesitation, was yes, not because a priest told me to, not because I read it somewhere, but because of Marcus. This all happened during the stretch of my life I call my invisible years. I was 43, working as a long-haul freight driver out of Louisville in Kentucky. My route at the time took me down through Tennessee and into northern Georgia, hauling industrial equipment for a manufacturing company that no longer exists. I had been doing it for 11 years. My wife, Carol, and I had separated 8 months prior, not because we stopped loving each other, but because she said she couldn't keep watching me disappear not just on the road but inside the house too. She was right. I was there physically, but something in me had gone quiet in a way I couldn't explain and didn't have the words to fix. My name is Daniel, and what I'm about to tell you is the truth. It was a Tuesday evening in late October, the kind of night where the sky can't decide between purple and black, and the highway feels like it belongs to no one. I was about 40 miles outside of Chattanooga on Interstate 24 when I saw him. He was standing on the shoulder of the road, not waving, not flagging anyone down, just standing there with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at something on the ground. There were no cars nearby, no flashers, no broken down vehicle, just a man, alone in the dark, on a stretch of highway that most people pass through without ever thinking twice. Something made me slow down. I don't know what it was, instinct maybe, or that particular kind of loneliness that recognizes itself in another person from a distance. I pulled the rig over about 60 yards ahead of him, stepped out and walked back. He was a black man, probably in his late 50s, with silver at his temples and the kind of face that looks like it has held a great amount of weight for a very long time. He was dressed neatly, which struck me as odd for someone standing on the side of a highway at night. A dark green jacket, clean slacks, boots that had seen better days but had been polished recently. He looked at me when I approached, and there was no fear in his expression, no relief either. Just a quiet acknowledgement, like he'd been expecting someone to eventually stop. "You need a lift?" I asked. "If you're heading toward Chattanooga," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, like a man who had learned that rushing words accomplished nothing. "I'm going through it," I said. "Hop in." His name was Marcus. He told me that within the first 5 minutes, once we were back on the highway and the cab had warmed up. He said he used to drive two, not 18-wheelers, but delivery trucks, smaller routes, local runs throughout Middle Tennessee. He said it like it was something from another life. "Used to?" I asked. "A lot of things used to be," he said, and smiled slightly, and looked out the window. We rode in silence for a while, which didn't feel uncomfortable. I've learned that silence in a truck cab is different from silence anywhere else. There's the hum of the engine, the white noise of the road, the occasional distant flash of another driver's lights. It creates a kind of confessional quality, I think. Something about being in motion in the dark makes people honest. "You live in Chattanooga?" I asked eventually. He paused a moment before answering. "I did," he said. "My daughter's there. My grandchildren." "You visiting?" He turned to look at me then, and something in his expression shifted, not sadness exactly, more like the look of a man who is deciding how much of a truth to tell. "Something like that," he said. I didn't push it. Instead, I told him about Carol, which surprised me because I hadn't told anyone about the separation, not even my brother. I'm not sure why it came out that night to this stranger, but Marcus listened the way very few people know how to, not waiting for his turn to talk, not preparing his advice, just genuinely receiving what I was saying. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You blame yourself," he said. "It wasn't a question." "Every day," I said. "That's a heavy thing to carry alone on a long road," he said. I laughed a little because it was true and because I hadn't heard it put that way before. "What about you?" I asked. "You said a lot of things used to be. What happened?" He exhaled slowly and looked straight ahead at the dark road stretching out before us. "I had a good life," he began. "Not easy, but good. Grew up in Nashville, oldest of 4 kids. Parents who worked hard and made sure we knew the value of both dignity and sacrifice. I married a woman named Patricia when I was 26. She was the kind of woman who could walk into a room full of strangers and leave it full of friends. I never understood how she did it." He paused. "We had 2 daughters together. Raised them right here in Tennessee. Built everything slowly the way you're supposed to." "What happened to Patricia?" I asked quietly. "She passed," he said. "Cancer, 7 years ago. The slow kind that takes a little every day until there's nothing left to take." "I'm sorry," I said, and meant it completely. "After she went," he continued, "I started making choices I'm not proud of, and not dramatic things, not the kind of things that make the news. Just small surrenders, one after another. I stopped showing up for my daughters the way I should have. I got deep into debt trying to fill something that can't be filled with money or things. I borrowed from people I shouldn't have borrowed from. I said things to my daughter Renee that I cannot take back. He stopped. You know how sometimes a person says the exact wrong thing at the exact worst moment, and you can watch the damage happen in real time right in front of you and you can't stop it? Yes, I said. I did that more than once, and eventually Renee stopped calling, stopped answering, and my younger daughter Simone followed her lead. I don't blame them. He said this flatly, without self-pity. I gave them every reason. We were about 15 miles outside of Chattanooga now. The city's glow was beginning to collect on the horizon, that amber warmth that cities give off at night when you're approaching from a distance. So what were you doing back there? I asked. On the shoulder of the road where I found you? There was an accident at that spot, he said. A few years back, a car went off the road. Nobody was hurt badly, thank God, but it shook a young man up pretty good, a kid who was driving home from his shift at a gas station. I used to drive that stretch for my delivery route, and I'd see him walking to work sometimes in the early morning because he didn't have a car yet. Something about that accident stayed with me. I'd go back sometimes and just think about all the things that can end in a single moment. Think about whether I'd done anything that mattered. He said the last part carefully, the way you say something that carries more weight than the words themselves. And had you, I asked, done anything that mattered? He didn't answer right away. Then, that's what I was still trying to figure out. We reached the edge of Chattanooga. I asked him where he wanted to be dropped off, and he gave me a street name near a neighborhood called Ridgedale. When I asked if he had someone waiting for him, he smiled again, that same quiet, knowing smile. I'll be fine, he said. I always end up where I'm supposed to be. I stopped at a gas station just off the exit, and he got out and thanked me. We shook hands. His grip was firm and warm. He looked at me one last time with those steady eyes and said something I've never forgotten. Daniel, don't let the quiet inside you become permanent. Carol is not gone, and neither are you. Then he walked off into the dark in the direction he'd pointed, and I stood there for a moment, not entirely sure what to do with myself. I want to tell you that I thought about Marcus for a few days, and then the road took over and I moved on. But that's not what happened. I thought about him constantly, about the way he spoke and about that specific combination of sorrow and calm that radiated from him. About how he knew my wife's name when I was almost certain I had never said it out loud during our conversation. I'd referred to her as my wife each time. I thought I'd imagined it. I let it go. 4 months later, in February, my route took me back through Chattanooga. It was late afternoon and I had a few hours before my scheduled pickup. So on an impulse, I decided to drive through Ridgedale, the neighborhood Marcus had directed me toward. I don't know what I was looking for. His face at a window, maybe. Some proof that the conversation had been real. I found myself on a quiet residential street lined with bare winter trees, and I pulled over and rolled down the window. There was an older woman sweeping her front steps, and I called over to her and asked if she knew a man named Marcus who lived in the area. She stopped sweeping and looked at me carefully. Marcus who? She said. I don't know his last name, I admitted. Black man, late 50s, silver hair, very calm way about him. Used to drive a delivery truck. The woman set her broom against the railing and walked slowly toward my truck. You're talking about Marcus Webb, she said, and her voice had gone soft in a way that made something tighten in my chest. Maybe, I said. Does he live nearby? She looked at me for a long moment with an expression that I can only describe as sorrowful compassion, the look someone gives you when they're about to tell you something that will rearrange your understanding of things. Honey, she said quietly, Marcus Webb passed away, going on 2 years now, October. He had a heart attack, they said, all alone in his apartment, couple streets over, she pointed. His daughters Renee and Simone, they live out near the North Shore now. They found him 3 days after. She paused. Broke those girls' hearts, I think, no matter what had happened between them. I sat in my truck for a long time after she walked back to her steps. My hands were resting on the wheel, and I was aware of my own breathing in a way I rarely am. October, she'd said. He had died in October, the same month I'd picked him up on that highway shoulder. I've turned this over in my mind more times than I can count, and I've stopped trying to explain it in ways that would satisfy a skeptic. What I can tell you is what I know, which is this. I spent 3 hours in that truck cab with a man who was patient and thoughtful and deeply, profoundly sad. A man who had made mistakes and knew it. A man who loved his daughters even in the wreckage of what he'd done. A man who, for reasons I still don't completely understand, knew my wife's name, and told me not to let her go. 3 days after that conversation, I called Carol for the first time since she'd asked for space. We talked for 2 hours. It was uncomfortable and uncertain, and we said things that needed to be said, including some things that hurt, but we kept talking, and we kept talking after that too. We got back together the following spring. It took work, real work, the kind that costs something, but we did it. We've been together since. I told Carol about Marcus about a year after we reconciled. She listened to the whole thing without saying a word, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I think he needed someone to listen to him one last time. And I think you were supposed to be the one." I don't know if that's exactly right, but I know it's close. What I've come to believe, and I say this not as a religious declaration, but simply as a man accounting for his own experiences, is that the people we lose don't always go all at once. Some of them linger near the parts of this world where they left things unfinished. Not in a frightening way, not like the movies show it, more like the way a song stays in a room after the radio's been turned off. Marcus was a man weighed down by the distance between who he'd been and who he'd failed to become. He'd hurt his daughters and he knew it. He'd gone alone into that apartment and never come out. And whatever part of him remained, whatever version of Marcus that needed one more conversation with one more stranger on a dark highway, I believe it found some peace eventually, because near that exit in Chattanooga, about a year after the woman on the steps told me what she told me, I was passing through on a night run, and I looked out the window at that neighborhood on the hill, and I felt nothing heavy, just the road, just the dark, just the hum of the engine and the particular silence that means everything is as it should be. I pray for him. I have since the day I learned the truth. And I think that matters, even if I can't prove it, especially if I can't prove it. If you're carrying something you haven't been able to put down, guilt, silence, distance from someone you love, I'm not going to tell you what to do with it. I'm just a truck driver from Louisville who had a strange night on an empty highway. But I will say this, the road has a way of putting in front of you exactly what you need to see if you're willing to slow down long enough to stop. I stopped for Marcus, and Marcus, in ways I'm still understanding, stopped for me. The Kane Road. Back in 2009, my younger brother Troy landed himself in the kind of trouble that a lot of men his age were landing in during those years. No job, no savings, and too proud to say so out loud. He'd been doing construction work in Atlanta since he was 22, doing well enough to rent his own place, drive a decent truck, keep a girlfriend. But when the company he worked for folded in the middle of the recession, everything came apart fast. 3 months later, he was back home in rural Louisiana, at our mother's house outside a small town called Faraday, sitting on the western bank of the Mississippi River, with a duffel bag and a look on his face like a man who'd been told a joke he didn't find funny. I wasn't thrilled about it, and I want to be honest here because I think the honesty matters to this story. My problem wasn't Troy coming home. I was glad to have him closer. What bothered me was what his presence would do to our mother. She was 62 years old, widowed, not in great health, and she had finally, after decades of raising us and working herself to the bone, found a rhythm to her days that suited her. Troy disrupts rhythms. It's not malice, it's just his nature. He's loud, he's restless, he needs friction the way some engines need a certain grade of fuel, and our mother had earned her quiet. My name is Calvin Dubois. I've been driving long-haul trucks since I was 23 years old, 18-wheelers primarily, running loads across the Gulf, South Louisiana, Mississippi, Texas, sometimes as far as Florida or up into Tennessee. I've put more miles on more roads than I can account for, and I've been doing it for over 20 years now. It's not a glamorous life, but it suits me in the same way the road suits certain people who can't fully explain why there's a clarity to it, a simplicity that I've never found elsewhere. What I'm going to tell you happened in the fall of that year, about 6 weeks after Troy had moved back home. I've told it twice in full to people I trust completely. I'm telling it now because enough time has passed that I can do it without my voice changing. My mother planted the idea, the way mothers do, without making it sound like an idea at all. I was over for Sunday dinner and she mentioned almost as a footnote that Troy was having a hard time finding local work. I already knew this, but then she said the thing I should have seen coming. You know what might help him? Riding along with you for a while, just to give him something. I set my fork down. There are moments with your mother where you understand that the argument has already been decided and you weren't present for it. This was one of those moments. The obstacle wasn't logistics, the obstacle was Troy himself, specifically Troy's relationship with authority, which could be described charitably as strained and accurately as non-existent. My brother does not like being told what to do, he never has. It was the engine behind every conflict he'd ever had with our father before he passed. With teachers, with foremen, with landlords, with anyone who occupied a position above him in any structure, real or perceived. He'd walk off a perfectly good job if a supervisor corrected him in a tone he didn't care for. That had happened at least twice that I knew of. Long-haul driving looks like freedom from the outside, and in some ways it is. But it's also a job governed by precise rules that are non-negotiable. Weight limits, driving hours, loading procedures, delivery windows. There's no room for someone who decides the rules or suggestions. We'd also traveled together before. When Troy was 17, I took him on a run up to Tennessee, thinking the exposure might do him some good. By the second day, I was counting my breath before responding to anything he said, just to avoid the argument. He was a teenager then. He was 25 now. I told myself that counted for something. I talked to him that Sunday evening, after our mother had gone to bed. I was direct with him because anything else would have been a waste of both our time. Troy, I know what's going on, and I'm not here to make you feel a certain way about it. Everybody hits the wall eventually. What I'm offering is this: you ride with me on my next few runs, help with loading and unloading at the stops, keep me company. I'll pay you out of pocket. It won't be much, but it'll be something moving until something better comes through. He started to respond, but I kept going. One condition. On the road, I'm the one who runs things. Not because of ego, because it's my truck, my CDL, and my name on every document. When I ask you to do something, you do it. We can talk about anything else any way you want, but on anything that touches the work, it's my call. Can you do that? He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once, and something in the way he did it told me he'd already been rehearsing this conversation in his head. Yeah, he said, I hear you. And Calvin, I mean this, thank you. We pulled out the following Tuesday at midnight. The load was industrial equipment bound for a refinery outside Beaumont, Texas. Standard run. I'd done it a dozen times. We'd be back in 3 days. The first few hours were the kind I hadn't expected. Good hours. Troy was different on the road than he was at home. Calmer, more open, freed somehow from whatever it was that made him difficult in stationary life. He talked about Atlanta, about the friends he'd made and lost touch with, about the woman he'd been seeing who left when the money did. He was honest about his part in things in a way that surprised me. No performance, no defensiveness, just a man looking at a chapter of his life with clear eyes. I talked too. Told him about a haul I'd done through West Texas the spring before, a dust storm that turned the sky a brown so dark it looked like dusk at noon. We laughed about things from our childhood, our father's expressions, the trouble we'd gotten into as kids, stories we'd told so many times they'd become myths. It was exactly the kind of conversation that only happens in the small hours of the morning on an empty road when the rest of the world has gone still. I remember thinking that this was going to be fine, that I'd been worried about nothing. I remember that thought very precisely because of what came next. It was around 4 a.m. We were well into the cane parishes by then, flat country, the highway cutting through it like a seam, the sugarcane standing high and dense on both sides in the dark. No other traffic. High beams on. I'd made this stretch of road so many times it had become something close to automatic. In the reach of the headlights, I saw something in the road. My first thought was debris, something off another truck, a bundle of material, a section of broken equipment. I slowed down and pulled toward the shoulder slightly, the way you do when you want a better look before committing. As we got closer, I revised my read. It was an animal, large, a deer, I thought. Something had hit it, but then I got close enough to see it properly, and I stopped the truck completely. It was a deer, a large doe laid in the road, not thrown there by an impact, not scattered the way roadkill looks, arranged, positioned flat-centered in the lane and in a way that had a deliberateness to it I felt before I could articulate it. The midsection had been opened. Cleaned out, I realized the cavity was empty, the surrounding pavement nearly clean, not torn into, not fed from messily. Something had been precise about it in a way that wasn't consistent with any animal I could think of. "What is that?" Troy asked. "I don't know yet. Come on." I took the flashlight and my firearm from behind the seat. Troy fell in beside me without being asked. The night air was warm and wet, heavy with the smell of the cane and the dark soil underneath it. Cane fields at night have their own quality. The stalks close enough together that sound behaves strangely between them, the dark inside the rows absolute and layered. I swept the flashlight along the shoulder of the road, and that's when Troy made a sound, not a shout, more like the sound a person makes when the air leaves their body all at once, and I moved toward him and put the beam on what he'd found. A man, in the grass at the edge of the road, between the asphalt and the wall of cane. A large man, heavy-set, wearing work clothes. A hunter. I thought there was a rifle in the grass near his right hand. He had been dead for several hours. What had been done to him shared certain qualities with what had been done to the deer, though the scale was different. I will not describe it beyond that. I will only say that it was not the work of any animal I have ever seen, and that I spent the first 20 years of my life in rural Louisiana and have seen what animals do. We did not touch anything. We walked back to the truck and I called 911. I told the dispatcher what we'd found and where. She told us to stay with the vehicle. We agreed. While we waited, something moved in the cane. The first time I told myself it was the stalk shifting. But then it came again, a sound of sustained movement, something large pushing through the rows at a measured pace, parallel to the road, level with where we were parked. It was directional. It was tracking us. Troy heard it too. I saw his hand tighten on his knee. Neither of us said anything about it when the deputies arrived 40 minutes later. I've thought about that since, why neither of us mentioned it. I think we both understood that we were still on the side of a dark road, and that whatever was in the cane was still in the cane, and that saying it out loud would change something about our situation in a way we weren't ready for. The detective who took our full statements was a calm, older man who wrote everything down without reacting. We told him how we found the body, the sequence of it, what we'd observed, standard questions, standard procedure. They released us after a little over an hour and told us to stay available. I called my dispatcher to explain the delay. We drove. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The night had thinned toward dawn, the black going soft and blue at the edges of the sky ahead of us. I thought, with a feeling I'm not proud of, about how far behind schedule we were. I focused on the road and on my breathing and on not thinking about the man in the grass and the precision of what had been done to him. Then Troy said quietly, "It followed us when we left." I looked at him. I saw it in the side mirror when we were pulling away. At the tree line, it was standing upright. He paused. "Calvin, it was big." I put my attention back on the road and pushed the accelerator down. The impact came 8 minutes later. It hit the side of the trailer with a force that rocked the entire rig sideways, solid and deliberate, nothing like a blowout or a road obstacle. I gripped the wheel and checked both mirrors, nothing visible. The cane was gone now. We were in open scrubland, low trees on both sides, Spanish moss hanging in the headlights. I checked the mirrors again, and on the right side at the edge of the tree line, I saw it for the first time. I have thought many times about how to describe what I saw. My mind's first move, the way minds always do, was to find a category for it. The closest category it found was man, tall, bipedal, a forward-leaning posture that brought its arms low, hands near the level of its knees. Its coloring was dark, a dark grayish skin between patches of what appeared to be coarse, matted hair across its shoulders and upper body. It moved with a speed that was wrong for something its size, and the wrongness of the movement was worse than the size itself. "Troy, take the gun from the glove box and watch the right side of the road." He took it. His hands were steadier than I expected. The second impact came from above. It struck the roof of the cab, and the sound was tremendous, and then it made a sound of its own. I have been trying for 15 years to find language for that sound. It was loud enough that I felt it in my chest and in the bones of my face. It had something structured in it, something that wasn't random, a rhythm almost, or a cadence. I'm not going to say what it sounded like because saying it sounds insane, but Troy and I looked at each other in that moment and I know we both registered the same thing. It rode up there for what felt like a long time. We heard it moving, the sound of its weight shifting, something hard dragging against the roof. Then it stopped. Then it dropped. It landed in the road in front of us, about 50 yards out, in the full wash of the headlights. 8 feet, I estimated, possibly more. The forward lean put its center of gravity low, its arms hanging nearly to the road. Its face, I will say only this about its face. It was not an animal face. The structure of it was human, recognizably human, and that was the detail that I have never made peace with and never will. Its eyes caught the headlights and threw them back. the way a cat's eyes do in the dark, but from a face that had the geometry of a man's face, old somehow, ageless in a way that had nothing to do with years. I drove into it at nearly 70 miles per hour. The impact was like hitting a wall. The windshield spiderwebbed from the force of the collision. The truck pulled violently to the right, and I fought to keep us on the road. I did not stop. I looked in the mirror once the road behind us was empty. No body on the pavement, no blood on the glass. Troy was pressed against the passenger door, one hand on the dashboard. He was not speaking, neither was I. We didn't see it again. 12 miles down the road, I pulled into an all-night truck stop and sat with the engine running for a while, hands on the wheel. The windshield was cracked badly enough that I'd need to report it. When I got out to check the front of the truck, the bumper and grille were dented from the impact. There was no blood. There was no fur, no tissue, no evidence that anything biological had been struck, just metal deformed by force. Troy stayed in the cab. When I climbed back in, we looked at each other and we had the kind of conversation that doesn't need words, where everything has been understood and there is nothing left to add. We made the delivery in Beaumont 7 hours behind schedule. I filed the damage as road debris, which was not entirely untrue. We drove home the next day in near silence, stopping once for gas and food, speaking about logistics and nothing else. Troy never rode with me again. He found work at a plant in Baton Rouge the following spring. Moved out of my mother's house, married a woman named Denise, had 2 boys. We talk every few weeks. We have discussed that night exactly twice in all the years since, once about a year after it happened, and once about 5 years later when he called me at 2 in the morning, and I knew before he said a word what had woken him. Both times he told me the same thing. He said it wasn't the size of it that stayed with him. It wasn't even the face. It was the deer. The way it had been placed in the road, the cleanliness of it, the deliberateness. He said, that thing wasn't just feeding, it was doing something. It had a reason for doing it the way it did it. And I don't know what that reason was, and I've decided I'm better off not knowing. I think he's right about that. Among the older Choctaw communities of the Gulf South, there is an account of a being called the Cachehotapalo, a creature that inhabits the margins of deep swampland and canebrake, described in the older sources as tall, dark-haired, human in shape but not in nature. It is not primarily characterized as a predator in the traditional sense. The accounts describe it as something territorial, something ancient, something that existed in these lowlands long before they were farmland or highway, something that watches, that follows, that when disturbed at its rituals, and the older accounts are specific about calling them rituals, makes known that it has been patient, and that its patience is not the same thing as harmlessness. I read about it years after that night by accident in a collection of regional folklore I found in a used bookstore in Lafayette. I sat with that book for a long time. I still run that route. Not often, but it comes up a few times a year. I keep the high beams on through the cane country. I keep the gun accessible. I don't stop for obstacles in the road anymore, not at that hour, not in that stretch. And I have made my peace with whatever that says about me. The last thing I want to say is this. I have spent a long time asking myself what that night was, and I have arrived at no answer I'm fully comfortable with. What I have arrived at is the following observation, that there are places in this country, rural places, places where the highway runs straight through land that was never meant to be a highway, where the darkness on either side of the road is not empty, where the things that live in it have their own patterns, their own purposes that have nothing to do with us, and that the most dangerous thing we can do is assume, because we built a road through the middle of it, that we're no longer in their territory. We are always in their territory. We just forget that at night when we're tired, moving fast, looking forward. It only takes one stop to remember.